Fine. Give them some rags and get them out of here, he barked. Soldiers tossed rusted chainmail fragments and worn leather armor at my feet like trash. Put them on and get out, a soldier shouted. Without looking at the officer, I picked up the foul-smelling gear and distributed it to Tom, Juan, and Jenny. In suffocating silence, they mechanically donned the armor that signaled their death. I took one last look at the checkpoint, then turned to Juan and whispered, "Let's go." The group retreated from the desperate checkpoint, vanishing into the chaotic shadows of the shanty town. Behind them, the cries and the approaching shouts of the Solonians sounded like a distant, alien world. After walking far enough to escape the noise, I collapsed against a cold dirt wall in a secluded alleyway. Looking at my comrades, who were now doomed because of me, I choked out a strained, "I'm sorry." Tom punched the wall in frustration, Juan hung his head, and Jenny wept silently while clutching her husband. No one answered. They felt a complex mix of resentment. If not for my background, they might have passed the checkpoint. Yet, without my desperate stand at the beacon tower, they would have died as corpses on the beach long ago. I had led them to the edge of hope, only for their own people to cast them back into hell. Eric, severely wounded and drifting in and out of consciousness, wheezed, "Don't blame yourself, sir. They wouldn't have let us, burdens, go anyway." The words pierced the heavy silence. It was true. To those in power, they were merely expendable, broken pawns. Realizing the outcome was likely inevitable regardless of my past, their resentment faded into a profound sense of powerlessness. I stood up, struggling. Find a place to rest. Even if we're to die, we need to catch our breath. They helped each other through the labyrinthine shanty town, dodging crowds and skirmishes. They eventually found a low, abandoned stone house. The interior was a wreck, stripped of furniture and thick with dust, mold, and the stench of panic. Fortunately, 2 crude wooden cots remained in the corner. They settled the wounded Eric and Juan, while Jenny and Tom used rags and the last of their water to dress their wounds. I and Jenny barricaded the flimsy wooden door with broken furniture. Exhausted, the group collapsed against the walls, lacking the strength to move. The room filled with heavy breathing and groans, the shadow of death looming over them as they awaited the end. Suddenly, thud, crash, a dull impact and the sound of splintering wood erupted from the second floor. Violent scuffling, muffled growls, and a woman's scream followed. I snapped awake, my eyes sharp, hand gripping my notched short sword. Tom and Jenny stared up at the dark stairwell in terror. The sounds of assault jolted me and Tom out of their lethargy. Exchanging looks, they shared a spark of shock, fury, and renewed resolve. "We're going up," I whispered firmly. I pointed to the stairs. "Jenny, stay here. Warn us if anything happens." Jenny nodded, gripping a wooden club, trembling but resolute as she blocked the entrance. I drew my notched sword and signaled Tom. Tom gripped a broken spear, and they crept up the creaking wooden stairs. The sounds grew clearer as they ascended. The man's leering, the tearing of fabric, and the woman's desperate sobs were nauseating. On the second-floor landing, I peered through the gap of the first door. A gaunt man was pinning a frail woman to the dusty floor. The woman struggled, her hands pinned above her head, legs kicking weakly. The man struck her hard across the face. She went limp, her crying silenced. My blood boiled, but I suppressed the urge to charge in. I signaled Tom to move on. As a veteran, I needed to assess the full threat. The first room was contained. I needed to check the others. The second and third doors were closed, but equally disturbing sounds emanated from within. The second room was quieter, filled with threats and pleading. The third room echoed with the rhythmic creaking of a bed and muffled sobs. It was clear, at least 3 groups of thugs were preying on victims in the house. Tom looked at me, and I was now radiating cold, lethal intent. I raised my notched blade, the edge glinting in the gloom. I signaled. Tom would take the first room, I would take the second. They would then regroup to deal with the third. Tom understood, suppressed his fear, and took his position against the wall. I glided to the second door, my body coiled like a panther. A deathly silence hung in the air, contrasting with the filth inside. Tom heard his own heart pounding. I nodded. "Go." Tom slammed his shoulder into the first door. Bang! The door burst open. Simultaneously, I twisted the lock on the second door and lunged inside like lightning. Tom charged into the first room, driving his broken spear into the back of the brute, who was still adjusting his clothes. Splat! A broken spearhead pierced the brute's waist, pinning him against the mud wall with a dull thud. The shaft vibrated violently from the impact. Only then did the brute react, his face twisting in agony and disbelief. He turned to see Tom at the door, his throat rattling as he stared in shock. The woman on the bed, disheveled and marked by a slap, froze in terror, covering her mouth to stifle a scream. In the next room, I moved with lethal speed. I burst in, locking eyes on the tall man pinning a woman to the bed. I lunged like a hunting leopard, slamming into the man's back. Ugh! The man collapsed onto the dirty bed, taking the woman down with him. I didn't hesitate, driving my short sword into the man's kidney with cold precision. I twisted the blade and struck repeatedly, my movements efficient and ruthless. Warm blood sprayed, staining my hands and the sheets. The man let out a few short gasps before going limp. The young woman beneath him stared in horror at my blood-spattered face and my dripping blade. She bit her lip to remain silent, trembling uncontrollably. I held a bloodied finger to my lips, signaling for silence. The woman nodded frantically, her eyes filled with fear and dazed relief. The sounds of the struggle had been distinct in the silent hallway. In the third room, the creaking bed stopped abruptly, followed by the sound of someone scrambling to get up. I slid off the bed, sword ready, and moved to the door to listen. "Jack? Mike? What the hell are you doing?" A gruff voice shouted as a door swung open, followed by heavy footsteps. The man was clearly suspicious but unaware of the danger. I counted the footsteps, timing my strike perfectly. Bang! I kicked the rusted door, sending it swinging outward with immense force. The heavy door slammed into the man's face. His nose shattered, and he collapsed, dropping his iron bar. I followed through, using the door and my own weight to pin the dazed man. The wood splintered under the pressure as I crushed him. The man struggled in vain. I drove my blade through the gaps in the door, stabbing blindly into the man's chest and abdomen. Splat! Splat! The man's screams faded into wet gurgles as his strength failed. Silence returned, save for the blood pooling from beneath the door. I struck a few more times to ensure the kill before stopping to catch my breath. I shoved the broken door aside, standing amidst the carnage. Tom emerged from the first room, pale and shaking, still gripping his spear. Seeing the gore and my blood-soaked appearance, Tom swallowed hard. I ignored him, washing my blade and hands in a water jar. They checked the 3 rooms. In the first, the woman sat trembling in the corner, the sole survivor. The second room was grimmer. Besides the survivor, another woman lay dead in the corner, strangled during the chaos. The young woman wept silently at the sight. The third room was a scene of horror, with 2 traumatized women huddled on the floor. 2 other women lay dead in the corner, clearly victims of brutal torture. Overwhelmed by the stench and the sight, Tom leaned against the wall and retched. Though he had seen war, this senseless cruelty shocked him. I remained expressionless, my face a cold mask. I surveyed the scene with detached weariness. Having seen the worst of humanity, I focused only on the living. "Get dressed, grab any weapons, and meet downstairs," I commanded calmly. The 4 survivors scrambled to clothe themselves in whatever they could find. They picked up the thugs' discarded weapons and followed me and Tom downstairs. Jenny, waiting below, exhaled in relief at their return. She froze, however, when she saw the 4 traumatized, wounded women trailing behind them. I signaled Jenny to stay alert and led the group into a cleaner room. In the candlelight, the 4 women stood in a line, trembling and refusing to meet my gaze. The atmosphere was suffocating, thick with the scent of blood and dust. I scanned the room and the broken women, trying to soften my tone. I asked the women why they stayed in the shanty town despite the Solonians' arrival, noting that remaining was a death sentence. The question shattered their fragile composure, and the 4 women broke into desolate, uncontrollable sobs. The youngest woman, though weathered by hardship, wiped her tears and spoke in a hoarse, trembling voice. She explained that the attackers were local thugs from the shanty town who, realizing they couldn't board the evacuation ships, had turned into beasts. They decided to indulge in cruelty before death, targeting women who were unable to escape. She looked despairingly at the silent harbor, admitting they were prostitutes, the lowest of the low, and had no place on the ships. They lacked the status and money to bribe their way onto the vessels, leaving them with nowhere to go but to wait for death. Overcome by grief, the four women huddled together, weeping as if abandoned by the world. Weber watched them, his heart heavy with a complex mix of emotions. He spoke with the weariness of a fellow outcast, admitting that he and his men were also unable to board the ships and were now trapped. He pointed outside, proposing they use this sturdy house as a base to rest and gather supplies before the Solonians arrived. He reasoned that the walls would offer a better chance of survival than being hunted in the open. The young woman stopped crying upon hearing this. Seeing the armed, resolute soldiers, a flicker of hope appeared in her eyes. She nodded firmly, telling them they were welcome to use the house. Her expression turned fierce as she demanded a weapon, even a kitchen knife, to fight the Solonians. She declared they would rather die taking a few enemies down with them than wait to be slaughtered. Her resolve moved Weber and his men. Weber looked at the woman with newfound respect. He realized these marginalized women possessed more courage than the officials and soldiers who had abandoned the populace to flee. Softening his gaze, Weber asked for her name. Mia, she replied, standing a little straighter. Weber nodded solemnly, telling her he would remember her bravery. After telling the women to stay alert, Weber returned to his group. Jenny asked who they were. Weber sat down, exhausted, and explained that the women were local residents who had been trapped after they dealt with the thugs upstairs. He recounted their story. The thugs had turned violent upon realizing they were abandoned. They had sought to vent their animalistic urges on the defenseless before the end. Tom slammed the ground in anger, while Jenny looked on with pity. Weber added that the women were prostitutes. Jenny and Tom fell silent, realizing the officers had deemed them useless and left them to die. The sound of the women's weeping from the next room underscored the tragedy. A heavy silence filled the room, shared by the wounded soldiers and the women, all outcasts abandoned by the world. Whether rejected for their status or their profession, they were all deemed useless. In this apocalyptic setting, past identities had vanished, leaving only the struggle for survival. I sighed, my exhaustion turning into resignation. I told my comrades that we were trapped, the checkpoints were closed, and the Solonians were everywhere. I looked at the stone house and the women next door. I noted the house was sturdy and secluded enough to hold out for a while. I decided we would stay there with the women, fighting to survive as long as possible. No one objected. In their despair, this alliance was their only flicker of hope. They had only one choice: hold their ground and wait for either rescue or death. Survival instinct bound the wounded soldiers and the women to the same sinking ship. The main port of the Iron Islands had become a surreal mix of hell and a gateway to hope. The docks were a cacophony of screams, pleas, and curses, drowned out by the crashing waves. The air smelled of sweat, tears, and distant gunpowder. Baron Werner stood on a high platform, coldly observing the chaos below. His guards held a tight perimeter, blocking the surging crowds. Only those with special tokens or escorted by officers could reach the boarding piers. The first group was boarding the transport ships in an orderly fashion. These were skilled craftsmen, doctors, and the families of Werner and Klein's most loyal officers. Their faces showed a mix of relief and confusion about the future. Werner watched them, a hint of satisfaction in his cold eyes. These people were the foundation for his and Klein's future in Confort. With these craftsmen and loyalists, he could maintain autonomy under the young Lord Karl rather than becoming a mere puppet. The thousands of civilians outside were, in his eyes, worthless compared to these assets. A voice called out from behind him. Knight Klein approached, covered in blood and dust, looking anxious. Werner asked about the situation without turning around. Klein reported that the beachhead had fallen. The Solonians were attacking the shanty town, and their outer defenses were failing. Unsurprised, Werner nodded and asked about the status of the shanty town's defenses. Klein reported that all harbor access points were sealed with debris and carriages, guarded by veterans equipped with bows and firearms. Refugees in the shanty town were armed with makeshift weapons and ordered to build barricades for urban warfare. Werner smiled coldly and ordered a new directive for the refugees and guards. Anyone who brings a Solonian soldier's head to the harbor for verification will earn a spot on the evacuation ships. Klein admired the strategy, noting it would force the desperate refugees to fight to the death, delaying the Solonians and buying time. Werner used false hope to turn desperate people into human shields for his retreat. This was the cold, effective power play of a leader in chaotic times. Klein asked when they would depart, eyeing the ships loading their core assets. Werner stated they would leave by dawn at the latest, once the final supplies and personnel were aboard. Relieved, Klein left to reinforce the defensive line. Klein hurried off to manage the line built on human lives. Werner watched the smoke-filled shanty town with cold, deep eyes. He viewed the impending slaughter of the abandoned as a necessary cost for his own survival. By dawn, he would sail for Conford with the Iron Islands remaining elite. The land and its people would be sacrificed, sinking into the abyss of war. In chaotic times, survival with capital is the only truth. Mercy is a luxury. The sunset stained the sky blood red, mirroring the bloodshed in the Iron Islands. Amidst chaos, another transport ship departed the crowded harbor, leaving desperate eyes behind. Simultaneously, the Petrel, a grim chamber of commerce merchant ship, struggled to dock. The gangplank was lowered as soon as the ship steadied. The desperate crowd surged forward like a flood. Soldiers struggled to hold back the tide of people with spears and sword hilts. Franz, the acting captain of the Petrel, watched calmly from a crate. He managed the flow to prevent a stampede. His hawk-like eyes scanned the faces, searching for someone. He was looking for Mia, a prostitute he met in the shanty town. She had provided valuable intelligence, and he was struck by her attempt to maintain dignity. He had hoped to save her, but he was disappointed. The people boarding were not the destitute refugees he expected. They were skilled, relatively well-dressed, and included soldiers and their families. Franz realized Werner and Klein were performing a final asset transfer. These were the skilled craftsmen, minor officials, and loyal families needed for the future. The truly poor and vulnerable were filtered out as expendable. Franz sneered at the politics of the situation, understanding the cold logic. Rational leaders prioritize the survival of core power, regardless of the moral cost. He remained a detached observer and executor. Franz pushed aside his regret and ordered the crew to load as many as possible. Completing the mission was his priority. The Petrel had been stripped of cargo to maximize passenger capacity. People were packed into every available space. The deck and cabins were overflowing. Designed for 50, the ship now held over 150, with some clinging to the railings. A sailor warned that the ship was dangerously overloaded and taking on water. Seeing the desperate crowd still on the pier, Franz hardened his heart and ordered the ship to depart. Sailors pushed away those trying to board and retracted the gangplank. As the anchor rose, those left behind wailed. Some jumped into the sea, only to be swallowed by the cold water. The Petrel caught the wind and slowly pulled away. The overloaded ship swayed, causing panic among the passengers. Franz looked back at the harbor one last time. The shore was a blur of waving arms and cries swallowed by darkness. Faint sounds of battle echoed from the shanty town. He sighed, etched the scene into his memory, and turned away. His mission to save the seeds was complete. The fate of those left behind was no longer his concern. In such times, individual influence is limited. The brief naval skirmish subsided. Smoke and debris floated on the water, evidence of the battle. Captain Jackson's Conford fleet used their superior range to repel the Solonians before regrouping. Brendan watched from the north wind, noting the transport fleet had reached safer waters and the Solonians were regrouping. He knew the risks of night combat, especially with civilians to protect. Cease pursuit. Rally to the main port for the final evacuation. Move quickly, Brendan ordered, prioritizing rescue over combat. Signaling the fleet, the battle-scarred Carnford ships, including the dented North Wind, Sea Lion, and Aegis, escorted the remaining transport vessels toward the Iron Islands main port. As the fleet, flying the spruce sword flag, appeared offshore, the desperate crowd on the docks erupted in a mix of hope and terror. Large ships meant more capacity, but also signaled the final chance. Unable to dock, the warships anchored in deep water, deploying countless small boats to ferry people back and forth. The North Wind and other large warships became the primary evacuation vessels due to their spacious holds. Under the soldiers' shouts, the valuable personnel, Werner and Klein's inner circle, core officials, their families, and elite craftsmen, were prioritized for boarding. The process was chaotic, marked by shoving and trampling, but the threat of bayonets and whips ensured the boarding proceeded. Amidst this turmoil, darkness fell rapidly. The last rays of sunset vanished, replaced by a cold, ink-black night. Night navigation in unknown waters carried immense risks. "My lord, all ships are at maximum capacity. We must depart immediately," Captain Jackson reported urgently. Decks and cabins were dangerously overcrowded, severely impacting the ship's stability and speed. Brendan looked toward the docks, where a dark mass of people still cried out in despair, but the gangplanks had already been retracted. Suppressing his pity, he ordered, "Weigh anchor. Hoist sails. Set course for Giant Island. Weigh anchor. Hoist sails." Horns blared as heavy anchors were raised and sails caught the wind under the moonlight. The North Wind led the fleet, carrying over 3,000 souls, the last essence of the Iron Islands, away from the ghost-like port. Brendan watched the receding coastline, illuminated by flickering torches and sporadic gunfire. The cries of the abandoned seemed to linger in the sea breeze. He realized the evacuation had exceeded the estimated 2,000, reaching nearly 3,000. He knew the extra 1,000 were mostly Baron Werner and Knight Klein's loyalists, their capital for future power. While politically pragmatic, the exclusion of others felt chillingly cold. Yet, for Carnford, skilled laborers were the priority. "Lord, I needed a return on my investment." Shaking off these thoughts, he focused on his duty as a soldier. "I hope they hold out," Brendan muttered, turning to plan for the overcrowding and potential pursuit. Operation Hannibal's first day concluded with mixed results and heavy casualties. On the highest reef, Baron Werner and Knight Klein watched the North Wind vanish into the night, leaving only its navigation light flickering like a distant star. Sea winds whipped their dust-covered cloaks. The port fell into a deathly silence, punctuated only by the encroaching sounds of Solonian combat from the shanty town. Werner sighed, his voice heavy with melancholy. Pointing to the dark sea, he reminisced, "Klein, look at the North Wind. A magnificent ship. Do you know, in my grandfather's time, when he was the Northern Territory's naval minister, we had 100 such ships, larger, sturdier, and better equipped than the North Wind. When they sailed, the masts were like a forest, the flags blocking the sky. The entire Northern Territory trembled under their shadow." His tone turned bitter. "Now? Those giants are at the bottom of the sea, dismantled for scrap, or left to rot until the poor burn them for warmth. Glory turned to dust, our foundation withered." Klein listened, feeling the Baron's profound loss. He understood the weight on the young Baron's shoulders as he watched his heritage collapse. It wasn't Werner's fault. The kingdom's military failure was total, and his guerrilla resistance was already a feat. This was merely an emotional release. Unable to offer empty promises, Klein responded pragmatically, "My lord, the past is inspiring. But we have saved the spark, our most loyal soldiers and skilled craftsmen. With them, hope remains. Carnford is our new beginning. One day, we will return to reclaim our glory." Werner stood silent, letting the wind lash his face. The approaching sounds of battle reminded them that the brutal reality had only just begun. The road ahead was thorny, but as long as the spark lived, there was hope for a resurgence. But when would that day come? At the Chapeau camp, opposite the main island, Legion Commander Gran stood like a dark iron tower on a reef, his lion-like mane whipped by the wind, his expression grim. His eyes, burning with wolfish hunger and impatience, tracked the Carnford fleet retreating into the night. Several damaged Solonian ships limped back to the shallows. Their shattered masts and casualties bore silent witness to the intensity of the naval clash. "Trash," Gran growled, his fist clenching. He had watched the battle. The enemy, aided by defecting Plantagenet sailors, had maneuvered with newfound agility. But it was the cannons. Carnford's broadsides were faster, longer-ranged, and more accurate. The chain shot, designed to shred sails and masts, was a nightmare. His own forces lacked mobile heavy artillery. Most of their captured cannons were stuck inland, unable to traverse the rugged terrain to the coast. The thought of those rusting guns caused Gron agonizing frustration. Carnford. Gron identified the source of the fleet immediately. In the Northern Territory, who else but that young lord who had repeatedly bested Harold could field such a force? They're here to steal our people, Gron realized, a mix of cold dread and fury surging within him. The Solonians were on the verge of seizing the Iron Islands after heavy casualties. However, Carnford intervened, attempting to evacuate the island's skilled craftsmen and experienced soldiers before the fall. If successful, the Solon army would capture nothing but a hollow, ruined island, rendering their military victory meaningless. Carnford would gain vital human resources and a reputation for heroism, effectively undermining Solon's strategic goals. They must not succeed, Gron snarled. He ordered an immediate, crushing offensive to seize the ports and sever the evacuation routes. Time was critical. Every hour meant hundreds of spoils escaping by sea. Gron turned, his heavy footsteps shaking the reef. He barked orders to his messenger with cold, thunderous authority. First, cancel the rest period for all landing forces. Use the entire reserve force to tear through their lines by sunrise. Second, order the fleet to bombard the ports relentlessly, regardless of damage, to prevent Carnford's ships from docking. Third, send a rider to Harold immediately. Report the situation and demand more cannons and reinforcements. Gron roared, sending the messenger scrambling. He stared at the burning Iron Islands, his fangs glinting in the dark. Mercy and rest were for the weak. In the struggle for resources, only the fastest and most ruthless would prevail. Under the cover of night, dozens of Solon landing craft silently gathered at the Shapo beachhead. 500 elite Solon soldiers, including 30 heavy-armored berserkers, waited like wolves in the shadows. The air was thick with the scent of salt, leather, rust, and bloodlust. Battle Commander Reiner, a scarred veteran, gave final instructions to his officers. Listen well. We are punching straight through this shanty town, not playing hide-and-seek. Advance along the main roads at full speed. Ignore minor resistance. Use berserkers to smash through any barricades. Our goal is the port behind the shanty town. Destroy their ships or seize the docks to cut off their escape. Understood, sir, the officers whispered. Reiner growled. For the glory of Solon. For Harold. For Solon. For the commander, the troops echoed. Reiner signaled, and light-armored scouts crept toward the maze-like shanty town. Their mission was to clear sentries for the main force. However, the defenders, motivated by Baron Werner's heads-for-tickets policy, remained vigilant. They had fortified the stone houses on the perimeter. Sentries kept watch, and torches illuminated the area to prevent night raids. As the Solon scouts entered the light, they were spotted. Enemies. Sector 3. Torches. A sentry shouted, throwing burning brands into the darkness. The light revealed the exposed scouts, who froze in shock. Fire, the officer screamed. Matchlock muskets and bows unleashed a volley. Lead and arrows tore through the scouts. Screams filled the air. The scouts were decimated instantly, with no survivors. The gunfire ignited the entire shanty town. Attack! Solonians! Sound the alarm. Block the roads. The area erupted into chaos, whistles, shouting, and civilian screams. Defenders rushed to their barricades, desperate to hold their ground. Reiner watched from the darkness. Seeing his scouts killed and the element of surprise lost, his face turned livid. Damn it! Reiner struck the reef. The stealth mission had failed. A full frontal assault was the only option. I drew my blade, the steel gleaming in the firelight. I roared, my voice cutting through the din. Night raid failed. All forces attack. For Solon. Kill them all. 500 Solon elites charged. A tidal wave of steel crashing into the scrambling defenders. Deep in the shanty town, 3 main roads leading to the port became desperate front lines. Makeshift barricades of doors, sandbags, and boat wreckage stood barely chest-high. In the moonlight, they looked absurdly tragic. Each barricade was defended by about 100 men. These were not elites, but broken soldiers and malnourished locals forced into service. They were the buffer sacrificed by Baron Werner to buy time. They knew their only hope for survival was a seat on a Carnford ship. That brutal order, trading lives for passage, was the only hope left for them and their families. They fought with a desperate, twisted resolve, one life traded for one Solonian's head, hoping to earn their families a ticket out of this hell. This belief kept their trembling legs steady and their crude weapons gripped tight. During the day, the Carnford fleet's fierce fire support had barely repelled the Solonians' probing attacks. Everyone knew this was merely the calm before the storm. Once the fleet departed, a deadlier onslaught would follow. As night fell and the Carnford fleet vanished, the Solonians' war horns sounded like a death knell in the darkness. "They're here," a voice hissed from behind the barricade, thick with terror. The defenders tensed, clutching rusted spears, notched blades, and sharpened sticks. Sweat dripped from their brows onto the cold earth, punctuated only by the sound of pounding hearts and ragged breathing. From the distance, the rhythmic, heavy thud of marching feet, the clatter of arms, and the Solonians' beast-like war cries grew deafeningly close. A shadow of death seemed to materialize, crushing their spirits as fear coiled around their hearts like a viper. Untrained youths trembled, their faces pale as paper, nearly collapsing. "Hold steady," a scarred veteran with a blood-soaked bandage roared, brandishing his blade to dispel the panic. "Look behind you. Think of your parents and children. Their survival depends on how many of these savages we kill tonight." "For the heads," a soldier screamed, his eyes bloodshot, inciting those around him. This brutal slogan acted like a stimulant, replacing fear with a twisted mix of desperation and greed. To survive and save their families, they had to become beasts. This brutal slogan acted like a stimulant, momentarily suppressing fear and igniting a desperate, greedy ferocity in their eyes. "Archers, ready," the officer shouted. Militia with old hunting bows shakily aimed into the darkness where the enemy approached. "Musketeers, check your flash pans. Wait for my command." The few musketeers nervously prepared their unreliable weapons, resting them on the barricade. The air grew thick with the stench of saltpeter, sweat, and despair. Finally, ghostly figures of Solon soldiers emerged from the darkness like a tide from hell. Their grim faces and gleaming blades caught the torchlight. "Loose! Fire!" The defenders launched their first and perhaps final organized volley. Ragged arrows and sparse musket fire struck the enemy. The Solon berserkers charged with giant shields. The Iron Islands musketeers, fearing their poorly maintained matchlock muskets would explode, used reduced powder loads, rendering their shots ineffective against armor. The arrows caused minor casualties, but were like pebbles in a river against the surging flood. For Solon, "Kill them all!" the Solon officer roared, and the berserkers accelerated their charge. Heavily armored berserkers, acting as human battering rams, charged the barricade behind ironclad shields. Boom! The shields slammed into the barricade of doors and wreckage, shattering wood and sending defenders reeling as the line buckled. "Hold! Use your spears!" the officer screamed. The defenders frantically thrust their crude weapons through the gaps. Their inferior weapons merely clattered against the berserkers' heavy plate and shields, leaving only white marks. Occasional thrusts that found gaps were stopped by chainmail and leather padding. A brutal stalemate ensued. The berserkers used brute force, while the defenders relied on the barricade and sheer will. Screams and the clash of steel filled the air as blood soaked the mud. Battle Commander Reiner observed the deadlock calmly. Seeing the berserkers were slowed by the barricade, he sought a way to break the defenders' formation. "You and you, crouch," Reiner ordered his light-armored elite soldiers, pointing to the backs of the berserkers at the barricade. The elites obeyed, interlocking their hands to form a step. 3 agile soldiers sprinted toward them. "Step!" The first soldier vaulted off the hands, then used a berserker's armored shoulder as a second platform. "Huh!" The attacker soared over the barricade. In midair, he swung his blade. A defender holding the barricade was struck in the neck and collapsed. More Solon elites followed, leaping into the defender's rear. "They're inside. Enemies behind us." The rear, manned by inexperienced youths, fell into chaos. Caught between the berserkers in front and the elites behind, the defenders were slaughtered. The front line collapsed, and the Solon army poured through the gap. "It's over. Run." The defense crumbled under Reiner's tactical maneuver. The survivors fled toward the second barricade, cut down from behind. Reiner watched coldly, waving his hand. Clear the remnants and push to the second line. Give them no respite. The Iron Island's defense was being torn apart. Like a plague, the collapse swept through the three main roads of the shantytown. Under the Solan army's organized assault and Reiner's tactical strikes, the first line of defense crumbled. Makeshift barricades were smashed. The remaining defenders and armed civilians, shattered by the overwhelming force, fled in panic, abandoning weapons and their dead. The Solonians remained focused. Their officers ignored the stragglers in the narrow alleys. Instead, they drove three spearheads deep into the heart of the shanty town toward the glowing core. They crushed all resistance and executed those who begged for mercy. Their goal was the port. Their boots trampled mud and blood, filling the streets with screams. The Solan army surged forward like a tide of death, leaving carnage in their wake. The three columns soon converged at the center of the shanty town. Before them stood the final, formidable line of defense. This barricade blocked the widest street leading to the port. It was heavily reinforced with logs, stones, and house beams, with gaps packed tight with sandbags. Sharpened stakes protruded from the top like fangs. This was the final gateway to the port. Defending it was Knight Klein, a top commander of the Iron Islands. Klein wore his ancestral plate armor, worn but well-maintained. Clad in cold steel, his eyes were sharp, his expression resolute. He gripped a simple yet lethal longsword, his family crest visible in the torchlight. Beside him stood dozens of elite guards and 100 survivors from the front. Seeing their commander on the front lines, the survivors steadied themselves and formed a defensive line. However, the first to reach the barricade were not Solonians, but panicked fleeing soldiers. "Open the gate. Save us. The Solonians are coming," they screamed. Hundreds of bloodied, terrified men pounded on the barricade, desperate for entry. Behind them, the Solonians' war cries grew louder. The defenders hesitated, looking to Klein. Klein watched the desperate faces with cold indifference. He knew that opening the gate would allow the Solonians to breach the line, dooming everyone. The entire defense would collapse. These broken men were now useless. He silenced his adjutant. His voice cut through the noise. "Prepare to engage." It was a cruel, absolute command. He sacrificed the stragglers to buy time. The defenders, shaken by his coldness, suppressed their pity. They leveled their spears and blades at the approaching enemy and their own comrades. Klein ignored the pleas, focusing on the dark, encroaching shadow. The main Solan force had arrived. The final battle began. I raised my sword, reflecting the flickering fire. The stragglers' cries became the prelude to the Solan assault. The Solan vanguard slaughtered the refugees, clearing a path for their advance. For Solan, break it, the officers roared. The assault began as Solan soldiers swarmed the barricade. They attempted to smash the barrier with shields and battle axes. But this barricade, built by Klein, was sturdy. The embedded logs and sandbags made it nearly impenetrable. "Hold! Spearmen, thrust!" Klein commanded calmly. The defenders fought back stubbornly. Spears darted through the gaps like vipers. Archers and musketeers fired from behind cover. Despite their old weapons, they inflicted heavy damage at close range. Squelch! Arg! Solan soldiers fell from ladders, pierced by spears or struck by arrows. Piles of corpses soon obstructed the attackers. The battle reached a brutal stalemate. The Solonians paid in blood for every inch. The air was filled with the sounds of slaughter. Battle Commander Reiner frowned. He watched the mounting casualties, but his real concern was time. He glanced at the beach, where more Solan troops were landing. He knew the Iron Island's defenders understood these alleys better than his men. If stalled here, his vanguard risked being flanked or surrounded once the enemy regrouped. He had to finish this quickly. "We can't waste time here," Reiner decided. He grabbed Agata and pointed to a dark, narrow alley. "Agata, take your men, flank them. Find a way behind the barricade and attack. Create chaos to help us break through." Agata, a Solan Decurion, saluted with a bloodthirsty grin. He handpicked 9 agile soldiers skilled in close quarters and stealth. "Follow me," Agata growled, leading his squad into a dark side alley, vanishing into the shadows. Reiner watched them go, then turned to the front line. "Keep attacking. Archers, suppress the walls. Berserkers, prepare for a second wave." He intended to pin the defenders down, creating an opening for Agata's flanking maneuver. Agata's elite squad snaked through the shadows, slipping away from the main battlefield toward the barricade's rear. The Iron Island's shanty town, however, was far more chaotic than expected. It was a labyrinth of crooked shacks and debris-choked alleys. The air reeked of filth, rot, and gunpowder. Relying on instinct, they soon lost their way in the maze. "Damn this place," Agata cursed, kicking a broken pot. They wandered aimlessly, occasionally encountering terrified refugees. When Agata tried to grab one for directions, the terrified civilians fled or collapsed in fear. Agata killed 2 in a rage, but it didn't help them find their way. "Boss, listen. Over there." A soldier pointed toward the sound of clashing steel. Agata ordered, "Follow the sound. Move." They pushed forward through the maze. As they passed a crumbling stone house, disaster struck. A massive log, meant for structural support, plummeted from a second-story window. It crashed down with lethal force. "Look out." Ah! The 3 rear Solon soldiers were crushed instantly. Bones shattered. They died before they could even scream. "Ambush!" Agata gasped, realizing they had walked into a trap. The attack continued immediately. The house door burst open, and 7 or 8 figures charged out like leopards. They were wounded, ragged refugees, some leaning on spears for support. Yet, they wore scavenged Solon leather and chainmail, wielding blades and sharpened sticks. Their eyes burned with a desperate, cold, and hateful resolve. Their leader, a scarred man with a blood-dripping short sword, stood firm. It was Weber and his team who had set this trap after hearing the Solon advance. Weber had rigged the log to drop, turning the house into a killing zone. "Kill for your lives." Weber roared, leading Tom, Jenny, Mia, and the others in a desperate charge against the stunned Solon soldiers. In the narrow alley, the clash was brutal. The Solon soldiers, hardened veterans, quickly recovered from the shock. Clang! Weber's short sword collided with Agata's heavy blade. Weber's arm numbed, but he used a makeshift table-lid shield to deflect Agata's follow-up strike. Both men were experienced. They knew this was a fight to the death. Agata relied on raw power, while Weber used the terrain to maneuver. They traded lightning-fast blows in the cramped space. Nearby, Tom lunged with a scavenged spear at a Solon soldier. The soldier caught the spear shaft with his bare hands, ignoring the blade. Ugh! Tom couldn't push the spear any further. He strained, his face turning red. Weakened by hunger, Tom lacked the strength of the well-fed Solon warrior. The soldier sneered, muscles bulging as he pushed the spear back. The wooden shaft groaned under the pressure. The women's group, led by Jenny, fared the worst. They fought with desperate courage. They managed to wound 2 soldiers during the initial surprise. But professional training soon overwhelmed their raw spirit. A soldier dodged Jenny's strike and kicked her hard in the stomach. Jenny flew back, slamming into a wall, unable to rise. Mia's kitchen knife snapped against a soldier's armor, and his blade sliced her arm to the bone. She screamed in agony, incapacitated. The other women were quickly beaten down. Within seconds, the initial advantage of Weber's team vanished. The tide turned rapidly. Tom was losing his struggle, the women were down, and Weber was forced onto the defensive against Agata. "Is that all?" Agata laughed, forcing Weber back with relentless strikes. The other Solon soldiers closed in on the wounded, eager to slaughter the rats. Mia, clutching her bleeding wrist, grew pale and dizzy. She backed against the wall, trying to escape the approaching soldier. The soldier grinned, savoring the terror of his prey. A Solon soldier raised his blade to execute Mia. She closed her eyes, awaiting death, until a sharp whistle pierced the air. A crude but sharp arrow shot from the alley entrance like a viper. It struck home. The arrow hit the soldier's side. Though blocked by leather armor, the impact and pain forced a shrill scream from him. He dropped his blade, clutching his bleeding wound. The surrounding Solon soldiers, Weber, and the dying Tom all turned toward the alley entrance. A thin figure stood in the shadows, holding an old but well-maintained crossbow. The attacker showed no fear. I discarded the empty crossbow and drew a heavy wood-chopping knife. A Solon soldier, enraged by the defiance, abandoned his victim to confront me. 2 others flanked me, ready to butcher the fool. Suddenly, they froze, their sneers replaced by horror. Behind me, a swarm of figures emerged from the gloom. Refugees armed with pitchforks, iron rods, and kitchen knives. They were gaunt and ragged, but their eyes burned with the desperate, greedy madness of those with nothing left to lose. Within seconds, the alley was choked by a silent, suffocating mass of people. The Solon soldiers panicked as they realized the other end of the alley was also blocked by a similar mob. They were completely surrounded. Panic gripped the soldiers, save for those still engaged in the fray. They huddled back to back, brandishing weapons at the rabble. The mob didn't flinch. They stared at the soldiers' armor and weapons, their tickets to survival. "For the tickets," someone screamed. "Kill the Solon bastards." The cry ignited the crowd. "Kill!" The mob surged forward like a flood, a desperate swarm of refugees and outcasts attacking the trapped soldiers. The skirmish turned into a brutal hunt. The hunters had become the prey. The Solon elite were now surrounded by a sea of madness. The narrow alley became a death trap. Agata, the centurion, was the first to face the tide. Moments earlier, Agata had been dominating Weber. He shattered Weber's makeshift shield and swung at his sword. The impact snapped Weber's blade in two. Weber stumbled back, defenseless. As Agata raised his blade for the killing blow, Weber braced for the end. Then, a cry rang out. "Kill him! For the tickets!" A refugee lunged at Agata's back with a rusted knife. Agata, a seasoned veteran, remained alert. He parried the strike and thrust his blade into the attacker's chest. The man fell, but more refugees swarmed in, eyes fixed on Agata's head. Agata roared, cutting down two more, his ferocity momentarily stalling the mob. In that split second, Weber saw his chance. He lunged, slamming his body into Agata's midsection. They collided. Both men tumbled into the mud and blood, grappling. Weber pinned Agata's sword arm, kneeing his gut. Agata struck back, trying to break free. They struggled, Agata's superior strength slowly gaining the upper hand. Suddenly, a small shadow darted from the crowd, wielding a discarded dagger. The blade struck. It pierced the gap between Agata's helmet and armor, sinking to the hilt. Agata stiffened, his eyes widening in shock and agony. His strength drained away, his throat rattling. Weber looked up into Agata's glazing eyes. Then, the mob descended. His head. "It's mine." The refugees swarmed the twitching body, eyes burning with greed. To them, Agata was no longer a man, but a ticket to life. They shoved Weber aside and hacked at Agata's neck with knives and stones. Agata's final struggles were silenced by the blood pouring from his wounds. Weber sat in the mud, stunned, watching the hellish scene unfold. Weber watched in horror as the refugees, driven by primal savagery, tore Agata's head from his neck. Blood sprayed like a fountain. Two refugees fought violently over the severed head, one clutching it while the other tried to pry it away. As they wrestled, Weber saw Agata's eyes flicker, a final, silent accusation against his cruel fate. The sight turned Weber's stomach, leaving him on the verge of vomiting despite his experience with violence. Agata's body lay in a pool of blood, a headless corpse already devoid of life. The head had vanished into the chaotic mob, claimed by some lucky scavenger. The shantytown's resistance shattered. The mob's greed was ignited by the bloodlust. They turned their attention to the remaining Solon soldiers, their last shred of sanity gone. The scent of blood and the promise of boat tickets fueled their raw, desperate frenzy. "Kill them! Take their heads!" the mob roared. The narrow alley became a hellscape of screams and the wet thud of blades hitting bone. The Solon soldiers, once the hunters, were now the prey. A soldier who had been pinning Tom down was swarmed by refugees before he could finish his kill. They pinned his limbs, and another refugee hacked at his neck with a rusted cleaver. His head was soon torn off, sparking another scramble. Other soldiers tried to form a defensive line, but they were quickly overwhelmed by the sheer, tidal wave of humanity. They were hacked to pieces, their heads becoming trophies for the mob. Weber forced himself to stay calm, despite his nausea. He realized these blood-crazed refugees were now as dangerous as the Solonians. He and his group could easily become the next targets. "We can't stay here," Weber growled. He pulled Tom, who was pale and bleeding from a neck wound, to his feet. He then checked on Jenny, who was huddled in a corner, nursing a bruised lip from a soldier's kick. Jenny nodded and struggled to stand. Weber found the 4 rescued women. 3 were trembling with minor injuries. Mia was in critical condition, her wrist gushing blood, unconscious from shock and blood loss. 2 women wept beside her, believing she was dying. "Take them back to the house now," Weber ordered, scooping up the unconscious Mia. She felt deathly cold. Tom and Ginny helped the others. They fled through a quiet path, avoiding the mob still fighting over heads, and raced toward their stone hideout. Fortunately, the chaos remained concentrated in the main alleys. They reached the stone house, and Weber slammed the door shut. Tom and Ginny barricaded the entrance with heavy furniture. Weber laid Mia on a bed of straw. Her wrist wound was deep, and she was fading fast. The other women sobbed, convinced she was lost. Weber hesitated, then made a choice. I pulled a small, oilcloth-wrapped item from a hidden pocket. Inside was a tiny ceramic vial sealed with wax. It was a precious militia potion, a reward from my military days, which I had kept as a final safeguard. I bit off the wax and sprinkled the fragrant white powder onto Mia's wound. Mia's body twitched at the contact. I tightly bandaged the wound to stop the bleeding. The bleeding slowed and stopped. It stopped, Ginny cried, hope returning to the group. Mia remained unconscious, but she was stabilized. Juan, limping with a wooden crutch, joined them from the next room. Ginny embraced her husband, weeping with relief. Tom watched the street through a crack in the door. The fighting outside continued, growing more frantic. Tom sat back, dejected. The Solonians are all dead, and their heads are gone. Our boat tickets are lost. I, checking Mia's pulse, looked up with a complex expression. Tickets can be replaced, but life is the priority, Weber said calmly. If they hadn't attacked, we would be the ones lying out there as headless corpses. In a way, I added, they saved our lives. Silence filled the room. Tom had no rebuttal. Ginny and Juan clung to each other, grateful to have survived the carnage. Yet, the sounds of the Solon assault grew closer, leaving them to wonder how long their sanctuary would hold. Afternoon, July 5th, year 1 of Sigmund I. After a harrowing escape and a cautious night at sea, Brendan's fleet of Iron Islands refugees reached the giant island anchorage at the northern tip of the southwest peninsula. As the familiar, rugged silhouette of the island and its humble wooden pier appeared, the survivors erupted in long-suppressed cheers of relief. "We've arrived. It's Conford." The deck erupted in cheers and tears as refugees realized they had survived. Some collapsed in relief, sobbing uncontrollably, while others embraced loved ones, finally releasing the pent-up terror and despair of their journey. Many crowded the railings, staring greedily at the land that promised safety, their faces a mix of exhaustion and profound gratitude. Even the hardened veterans felt their tension ease, their eyes misting over. "Maintain order. Return to your positions and follow the sailors' instructions." Brendan's voice boomed, relayed by officers to prevent a stampede. Though he understood their relief, his duty as commander was to ensure an orderly landing. The simple docks of Giant Island soon spotted the massive returning fleet. Bells rang out as small transport boats and barges scrambled to meet the fleet, ready to ferry people and supplies. Standing on the north wind, Brendan ordered, "Transport ships first. Drop the gangplanks and get the refugees ashore. Warships, take up defensive positions. Refill water and load supplies immediately. We leave within 4 hours to return to the Iron Islands by nightfall." He warned his officers, "The Solonians won't wait. If they realize we've evacuated, they'll strike the Iron Islands to cut off our rescue efforts. We must be fast." The officers saluted and moved to execute their tasks. The scene became a hive of activity. Medium merchant ships like the Petrel docked, allowing refugees to disembark onto solid ground. Larger warships like the North Wind anchored in deep water, relying on a swarm of small boats to shuttle between ship and shore. These boats first delivered water and rations, black bread, salted fish, and vegetables, to the warships. After unloading, they ferried 10 refugees at a time back to the docks. Each arrival triggered a fresh wave of emotion on the pier. Many survivors knelt to kiss the ground, whispering prayers of thanks. Conford soldiers politely but firmly ushered them away to clear space for the next arrivals. "Keep moving. Follow the signs to the temporary shelters. Hot porridge is waiting," officials shouted, maintaining the flow. Registration points were set up to record names and skills before directing refugees to tented camps. Large pots of hot food were ready, and medics provided basic care for the wounded. The process was rushed, but demonstrated Conford's impressive organizational capability. An officer helped his weak wife onto the pier. Breathing in the scent of sea air and cooking fires, he felt a rare sense of stability. He looked back at the north wind, feeling deep gratitude toward Brendan and the Lord of Conford. We really made it," his wife sobbed. "Yes, we did," he replied, gripping her hand. "Let's get food and tend to your wounds." Brendan remained vigilant on the north wind. He supervised the transfer while receiving reports from his officers. 2,000 received, sir. Order is stable, but we are critically low on medicine. Supplies are being loaded. We'll be ready in 2 hours. No sign of Solonians to the northwest. Brendan ordered, "Send a fast ship to the main city. Tell Edgar we need urgent shipments of food, medicine, and building materials. Also, recruit every available physician. Tell him the refugee count exceeds expectations. We must be prepared." "Yes, sir." As the sun set, the fleet and docks glowed in the golden light. Deep in the night at Conford Castle, I sat by the fireplace, my shadow cast against a wall covered in maps. A rough, newly drawn map of the Southwest Peninsula and its surroundings lay on my oak table. It marked mountains, rivers, and strategic points like Tyrol Fortress and various ports recently seized by the Conford army. I sat hunched over, rubbing my stubble, deep in thought. While the capture of the peninsula was a strategic victory, the administrative burden was immense. The region was far from the core, diverse in population, and potentially filled with hidden Solonians. Direct rule from Conford was inefficient and costly. Feudalism, I whispered, eyeing the new territory. It was the most viable path, granting land to the loyal subordinates who had fought for me. This would boost morale, as land was the ultimate reward for their service. It would also ensure the land was managed by those with a vested interest in its defense and development. By turning these heroes into local lords, they would act as anchors, securing the peninsula more effectively than any distant official. However, my system differed fundamentally from the traditional feudalism of the Plantagenet kingdom. Conford's structure was born from a defensive war, centered on a standing army loyal solely to the lord. The key difference lay in military authority. In Conford, the power to recruit, train, and command all armed forces remained absolutely centralized in me. There were no private armies or knightly retinues allowed. All soldiers swore loyalty to the lord, and all pay and supplies were provided by the lord's manor. The new lords were stripped of the most dangerous power, the military. Without the ability to raise private forces, they had no means to challenge the lord's authority. This kept them in a structurally subordinate position, ensuring the lord's absolute control. I distributed land to my followers not for traditional feudal indirect rule, but for pragmatic reasons. First, it rewards merit and secures political loyalty, binding my inner circle's fate to the prosperity of Conford. Second, it improves administrative efficiency. The remote, sparsely populated Southwest Peninsula requires resident nobles to manage production and order, reducing the lord's direct management costs. Thus, Conford's nobles are restricted to the status of high-level tax farmers or gentry, lacking the autonomy of traditional feudal lords. They possess no independent taxation rights. Tax laws and rates are set by the lord's manor, with collection handled by centrally appointed officials. Noble income is limited to land rents and specific profit shares, strictly defined rather than autonomously controlled. They hold no independent judicial authority. Laws are uniform, enacted by the lord's manor and enforced by appointed judges. Nobles may mediate minor disputes, but serious criminal and property cases remain under central control. Land ownership is conditional. It is a revocable right of use rather than absolute hereditary ownership. The lord retains ultimate disposal rights, allowing for land reclamation if a noble commits crimes, fails to produce an heir, or threatens the territory. This status lacks traditional feudal stability, relying instead on the lord's favor and continued loyalty. Political and administrative autonomy is severely limited. Appointments, major construction, and external diplomacy are all controlled by the lord's manor. Nobles act as local agents of the Lord's policy, not as independent rulers. In short, this system is a specialized design for the northern frontier, intended to build a centralized, efficient regime capable of surviving crises. By monopolizing violence and resources, it ensures absolute authority and prevents the centrifugal tendencies common in feudalism. While enjoying high status and wealth, these nobles have their political power castrated to prevent them from challenging the center. It is a highly pragmatic, domesticated version of feudalism. Brendan is loyal and brave. I grant him the fertile Heligoland Valley and the route to Tyrol as Baron of Heligoland Valley to secure the peninsula's interior. Roland is fierce. I grant him the eastern hills facing Solon's remnants as Baron of East Mirror Guardian to hold the eastern gate. Richter shall be Knight of South Bay, managing the southern coast. He will run trading posts openly while controlling an intelligence network in the shadows. Edgar has served well. I grant him the northwestern region as Baron of Oak Town to oversee agriculture and livestock in his retirement. I carefully outlined these regions on my map, adding names and notes. I trusted these veterans, our bond forged in blood and fire. While I trusted them, as a lord, I had to plan for the long term. To prevent future fragmentation, I had to ensure a balance of power. My gaze sharpened as I focused on key strategic points. First, Winter's Port and other deep-water harbors. These ports are the lifeblood of trade and military projection for the peninsula. These ports and their surrounding fortresses must remain under direct control, managed by loyal officials and garrisoned by the Lord's own troops. This ensures control over the sea and the ability to suppress any vassal. Second, I planned a royal road connecting all fiefs to Confort. I drew a line from Winter's Port, winding through the main settlements. The road passes through Brendan's Valley, Roland's border, and near Edgar's estate, connecting to the main Confort artery. This road is an economic necessity. Without it, vassals would impose tolls, stifling trade. It is also a military necessity, allowing for rapid reinforcements or the suppression of rebellious vassals. The road serves as a constant reminder of the Lord's supreme authority. This road and its surrounding land must be directly administered, I decided. No vassal may tax or obstruct it. This plan creates a vibrant feudal network for local governance. By retaining control of ports and the central artery, I ensure absolute authority over the new territory. I leaned back, reviewing my fiefdom and balance scheme. This is just the beginning. Details regarding boundaries and oaths will be finalized with Edgar and codified later. The direction is clear: reward the loyal, incentivize the troops, and prevent fragmentation. A sharp, rhythmic knocking interrupted my thoughts. "Enter," I said calmly. Edgar, the chief administrator, hurried in. He looked exhausted from travel, yet his eyes burned with suppressed excitement. "My lord, good news. Brendan's fleet has returned and safely reached Giant Island." I looked up, eyes flashing, and leaned forward. "What is the situation? How many were rescued?" "They all returned. Over 3,000 people. More than our estimate. They are currently being registered at Giant Island." 3,000. I was surprised. I recall the fleet's capacity was only 2,000. Edgar smiled bitterly. It was a severe overload. Sailors say the refugees were packed into every corner, even clinging to the ship's sides. Brendan couldn't bear to leave them behind. Thankfully, there were no storms. I nodded slowly, tapping my desk. I could imagine the scene. In the face of war, the instinct to survive overrides all rules. Did Baron Werner and Knight Klein arrive with the fleet? I asked, knowing their safe extraction was critical. Edgar reported that Baron Werner and Knight Klein remained on the Iron Islands to command the rear guard, buying time for the evacuation. My eyes flickered with complex light, my lips curling into a meaningful smile. "They stayed? That is unexpected," I added with a hint of admiration. Baron Werner is not merely a power-hungry mediocrity. Choosing to die with his post shows a soldier's integrity and noble responsibility, far better than those who flee at the first sign of trouble. I shifted to practical matters. Who arrived in this batch? As expected, the 3,000 are the Iron Islands core, Edgar replied calmly. They include skilled craftsmen, lower officials, and the families of Werner and Klein's most loyal, battle-hardened elites. Clearly, they intend to use these people as capital to secure their standing under your rule. I chuckled confidently. Capital? No matter. If they want to use this as a stepping stone, so be it. Useful people are exactly what Cranford needs. Craftsmen produce, soldiers fight, officials govern. As long as they follow my rules, their capital only accelerates Cranford's growth. It is a win-win. I stood, gazing into the night, envisioning the refugees on Giant Island. Where is Brendan? I asked. Brendan hasn't rested, Edgar replied with respect. After offloading refugees and supplies on Giant Island, he sailed back toward the Iron Islands 2 hours ago. He intends to squeeze in as many trips as possible during the lull in Solonian attacks. I struck the window frame. Good. Brendan is right. Time is life. I turned to Edgar. You're back just in time. The influx of 3,000 people puts immense pressure on Giant Island and the Southwest Peninsula. First, food. Mobilize supplies from Cranford for 5,000 people for half a month. Distribute seeds and tools to the refugees for spring planting. Second, housing. Organize craftsmen and refugees to build temporary shelters along the coast. Prioritize sanitation. Third, order. Deploy soldiers and officials to register the refugees by skill and origin. Ensure they know that hard work will be rewarded. Fourth, and most important, I pointed to the map. We need a Southwest Peninsula Development and Enfeoffment Ordinance. I will establish nightly fiefs and manors for Brendan, Roland, Richter, and you. You will manage land reclamation and militia training, while the Lord's Manor retains direct control of ports and main roads. Edgar listened, his eyes bright with understanding. He grasped my intent to reward loyalty while maintaining central control. Understood, my lord. I shall attend to it immediately. Edgar bowed, his fatigue replaced by drive. Go, I said, looking at the map. Tell Brendan that Cranford is his shield. Save as many as he can, but know his limits. Edgar saluted and exited. On July 7th, Baron Werner issued a chilling final order in the shanty town of the Iron Islands. The decree spread like a death sentence. The Cranford fleet is making its final rescue. After this, they will not return. Boarding requirement: 3 Solonian heads. Priority goes to those with the most kills. The order stripped away all pretense, reducing survival to a bloody, primal law of the jungle. It turned despair into fuel, igniting a twisted, destructive fire of resistance. The shantytown became a meat grinder. Driven by the 3 heads ultimatum, refugees and soldiers alike descended into terrifying madness. They abandoned defensive positions to hunt in small, ghost-like groups. They set traps, tripwires, falling rocks, and hidden spikes. They ambushed Solonian soldiers from rooftops and sewers, using kitchen knives, pitchforks, and even their teeth. Their goal was singular: heads to trade for passage. They fought with suicidal ferocity. This asymmetric urban warfare became a nightmare for the Solonian elites. A trained soldier might kill 10 refugees, only to be taken down by the 11th in a suicide strike. The refugees' eyes held no fear, only a greedy hunger for heads. The Solonians suffered heavy losses, stepping over their own headless comrades. Even Gron, commander of the Hound Legion, grew frustrated. He attempted to use surrendered Plantagenet officials to call for a parley. Citizens of the Iron Islands, lay down your arms. Harold promises you will live if you surrender. They were met only with arrows, stones, and curses. Get out, you barbarian dogs. We know you'll kill us anyway. Bring us 3 Solonian heads. Werner's order had destroyed all trust. To the survivors, surrender meant death. Only by killing could they carve a path to salvation. Meanwhile, Knight Klein used the time bought by the refugees to fortify the port. He directed his core troops to reinforce the final defenses. They tore down houses to build 3 new, massive barricades on the main road. The barricades were lined with spikes and stocked with boiling pitch, turning every street into a death trap. Solonian fire attacks were thwarted by the island's damp air and abundant water. Attempts to flank through the mountains were blocked by the well-defended stone castles of the local nobility. Gron's naval attempt to shell the port also failed. The battered Iron Islands Navy, fueled by a death-defying resolve, launched a final counterattack. They rammed their burning ships into the Solonian fleet, and in a miraculous feat, managed to capture a smaller Solonian warship. Though minor, this resistance boosted morale and stalled the Solonians' naval assault. After a day of fierce fighting, the Solon army, despite their superior numbers, failed to make a decisive breakthrough, stalling just 100 meters from the port. Every ruin taken cost the Solonians dearly, while Werner's brutal orders only hardened the defenders' resolve. The Iron Islands became a meat grinder, draining the Solonians' blood. Standing on his command post, Gron watched the slow progress with a dark, grim expression. Time was slipping away. If the Carnford fleet arrived while the port still held, the Solonian strategic victory would be severely diminished. Order the Berserker Regiment to charge. Gron commanded coldly. Use their lives to bridge the final 100 meters by nightfall. The night on the Iron Islands was suffocating, drenched in fire and despair. Baron Werner stood like a statue on his platform, staring into the dark southern sea. The sea breeze carried the stench of blood and smoke, failing to disperse his deep anxiety. He searched the darkness for the promised Carnford fleet, his last hope. The sounds of battle from the shanty town grew louder, like a death knell for everyone at the port. Werner knew Klein and the refugees, driven mad by the Three Heads bounty, had bled dry. The shanty town would fall tonight. Soon, the Solonian Wolfhead banners would appear at the port's edge. There was no more time. The port was a scene of frantic, apocalyptic preparation. Under flickering torches, Werner's 500 most loyal soldiers reinforced the final defensive line with crates, ship keels, and sandbags. This was the final barrier. Its breach meant death for all. Sailors and conscripts were desperately building makeshift barges from salvaged ship planks, beams, and furniture. These crude, flat rafts lacked sails or rudders, held together only by nails and rope. The plan was to tether these barges to the Carnford fleet's ships, dragging them to safety. It was the only way to maximize the number of survivors. Everyone knew the risk of capsizing in rough seas, but it was their only chance. Survival was a matter of luck and fate. No one complained. They worked feverishly, racing against death. Make way. I have 3 heads. Let me through. Several blood-soaked men, clutching severed Solonian heads, shoved through the crowd to the registration officer. They threw their gruesome trophies down, eyes wild with the primal instinct to survive. These were the lucky madmen who had crawled out of the hellish shantytown. The officer mechanically verified the heads and checked them off the list, waving them into the core area. Entry did not guarantee immediate boarding. They were handed crude weapons and ordered to join the defense. Soldiers board first. You wait for the next wave, the officer stated coldly, offering them a sliver of hope. At least they had earned their place in line. These survivors turned back toward the darkness, fighting for the chance to be in that next wave. Werner turned his gaze from the sea to the desperate scene at the port. His 500 core soldiers remained disciplined, gripping their weapons despite their exhaustion. Beyond them were the crazed refugees and the hollow-eyed civilians who lacked even a ticket to board. Nearly 10,000 people were crammed into this final, doomed strip of land. Aside from Klein's rear guard, the rest were abandoned souls. Werner inhaled the foul air, suppressing his guilt, anxiety, and the weight of his command. He stepped to the edge of the platform and shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. Warriors of the Iron Islands. Everyone who wants to live. The port fell silent, all eyes fixed on him. I know you are tired and afraid. But look behind you. The sea is our only path to life. The Carnford fleet will come. I, Werner Fischer, swear on my family honor to fight until the last ship departs. He pointed his sword toward the approaching fire. The Solonians want our land, but we will pave our path with their blood. Hold this line for your families and yourselves. For the Iron Islands. For survival, he roared. For survival, the crowd echoed, their desperation momentarily overcoming their fear. Werner sheathed his sword, whispering to himself, it's the final day. His hope was short-lived. The battle sounds from the shanty town suddenly shifted. A deafening explosion shattered the air, followed by the triumphant, wolf-like howls of the Solonians as they surged toward the port. Fire consumed the shanty town, while the sound of siege engines and arrows intensified on the flanks. The Solonians were tightening their encirclement, determined to finish the slaughter. The stone castle and villas on the hill held firm, using terrain and projectiles to stall the enemy. Yet, the shanty town had fallen, leaving the defenders exposed. Panic erupted among the crowds gathered behind the harbor defenses. The lucky ones, who had been celebrating their kills, now stared in terror toward the approaching slaughter. "Look, people are running this way," a sentry shouted. A bloodied, retreating group emerged from the streets, led by the battered knight Klein. After surviving a hail of arrows, the remaining 100 soldiers stumbled through the harbor's defensive gap. "Seal the gap. Now," Klein roared, his face a mask of blood and gore. I leaned on my notched sword, breathing heavily with desperate resolve. Werner rushed to support me, demanding a status report. Klein rasped that the shanty town was lost. They had barely escaped, leaving fewer than 200 men. Only 400 or 500 refugees made it out, Klein choked out, mourning the thousands left behind. Werner realized they had only 700 souls left. There was no time to grieve for the thousands lost. Werner rallied the survivors, praising their bravery and declaring the harbor their final stand. He drew his sword, shouting, "For the honor of the Iron Islands. Show these Sorin barbarians the spirit of the Plantagenet army." The survivors let out a ragged, desperate war cry. Driven by survival and duty, they reformed their defensive line. Then, the enemy appeared. Sullen soldiers surged from the burning ruins like wolves. Though wounded, their bloodlust was intense. They spotted the harbor defenders and the trapped civilians. The Solonians grinned, seeing only easy spoils. "Kill them all," a sullen officer roared, leading the charge. Werner and Klein screamed orders. "Archers, fire. Spearmen, hold. Musketeer squad, free fire." The final battle exploded in the narrow harbor. Arrows and musket fire cut down the front line, but the Solonians pressed forward, crashing into the barricades. The air filled with the sounds of combat. The harbor became a slaughterhouse. The line buckled under the assault, with defenders falling every second. Werner and Klein fought on the front lines, though Werner kept glancing at the dark southern horizon. "Where's the Confort fleet? If they don't arrive, we are all doomed." The stone house in the shanty town was now a death trap. I watched the streets from a broken window. The scene outside was hellish. The streets were eerily empty. Sullen soldiers were streaming toward the harbor to finish the job. Small squads were executing survivors hiding in the ruins. I knew the harbor was likely falling. Worse, the fire was spreading rapidly, fueled by the sea wind. The flames would reach my hideout soon. "We can't stay," I decided. Staying meant certain death by fire or execution. Our only hope was the harbor and the arrival of the Confort fleet. I descended to the ground floor. The group looked at me with fear and fading hope. Eric and Juan were barely mobile. Their wounds remained severe. Mia was feverish and weak, her arm injury still a threat. The others were exhausted and terrified. I spoke firmly. "Grab your weapons and anything to protect yourselves. We must leave now." My words caused a stir of panic. "But the Solonians are everywhere, and the fire," Jenny cried. "Staying here is death." I insisted, pointing toward the harbor. "The battle is still raging. The Confort ships are our only chance. We must reach the docks." I looked sharply at the group, especially the 4 women. "Solonian heads are useless now. Baron Werner's rules are for the port. We need to reach the docks and board that ship. It's our only chance." I moved to the corner, where they had piled salvaged leather armor and chainmail fragments from dead Solon soldiers and thugs. "Put these on. Even a scrap of leather can stop a stray arrow." I donned a Solon leather cuirass over my uniform and grabbed a dented round shield. Tom gritted his teeth, donned a leather vest, tucked a notched short sword into his belt, and gripped a sharpened iron rod. Eric and Juan helped each other put on makeshift protection. Jenny and the other women scrambled to strap metal scraps, thick leather, or layered burlap to their bodies. Mia watched them, her eyes filled with despair, knowing she was a burden. Weber knelt before her, his voice firm. "Mia, hold on. There are doctors in Confort. You want to live, don't you?" Mia looked into his piercing eyes and nodded weakly. "Tom, Jenny, take turns carrying Mia. Eric, Juan, stay close. Everyone else, weapons ready. Our goal isn't to fight, but to run. Avoid the Solonians and reach the port." Weber commanded. I checked their gear, then pressed my ear against the door, listening to the screams, crackling fires, and distant shouts of the Solonians. "Get ready," Weber whispered, hand on the door. "On 3, we charge. No matter what happens, don't stop. Don't look back. 1, 2, 3. Weber and Tom shoved the barricade aside and cracked the door. Scorching air and thick smoke rushed in, causing them to cough. I peered out. The alley was empty, but the sky glowed red, and footsteps approached from multiple directions. "Go!" Weber sprinted out like a leopard, hugging the shadows toward the port. The battered group, Tom carrying Mia, Jenny supporting Juan, and the others, charged into the fire-ravaged ruins, desperate for survival. The final defense of the Iron Island's main port had become a living hell. Baron Werner's tactic of backing the defenders against the sea had ignited their fighting spirit, but at a brutal cost. The defensive line was shattered, sandbags and crates were destroyed. The battle had devolved into bloody skirmishes over every remaining obstacle. Solon's soldiers surged like a tide, while defenders fought with their bare hands, wooden boards, and whatever they could find. The elite Solon soldiers fought with lethal efficiency, but the desperate defenders and refugees fought with a terrifying, suicidal madness. Men fell, women picked up blades, elders grabbed soldiers' legs to create openings, children charged with oil jars to die with the enemy. It was a suicidal war of attrition, with casualties far exceeding the enemy's. Blood stained the docks, flowing into the sea, while corpses filled the trenches. Baron Werner fought on the front lines, his plate armor dented and bloodied, his sword notched. After killing a Solon captain, he was wounded in the leg and dragged back for a quick bandage. "Baron, the left flank is collapsing. Captain Jenkins is dead," a bloodied officer cried. "The right flank needs support. We're out of arrows. The men are throwing rocks." Hearing the cries and the approaching roars of the Solonians, Werner's heart sank. The collapse was imminent. He felt deep regret for staying behind for the sake of integrity. If he had left with the Confort fleet, he would be safe in the southwest peninsula instead of dying on this isolated island. "It's over. Confort. You were too late," Werner thought, his sword slipping from his hand. Exhaustion and despair overwhelmed him. He could smell the breath of the approaching Solonians. Suddenly, a cry rang out. Look at the sea. It's the ships. The Confort fleet is here." The scream came from the sailors at the barges, filled with hysterical joy. Werner snapped his eyes open, struggling to look toward the horizon. Both the defenders and the Solonians paused, turning their eyes to the south. In the darkness, faint lights appeared on the horizon. They multiplied and brightened. The silhouettes of warships emerged like sea monsters, charging toward the port. The banners of Confort were visible in the lantern light, the hope of survival. They really came," Werner whispered, his lips trembling. Adrenaline surged through him, banishing his exhaustion. He stood tall, ignoring his wound, and raised his notched sword. "Reinforcements. It's the Confort fleet. They're here. Warriors of the Iron Islands. Hold the line. For survival, kill them all. Reinforcements are here. Kill them. For Confort. For survival." The flame of hope reignited the defenders, who charged with renewed, desperate strength. Even the wounded rose to fight. The morale of the port shifted instantly. The Solon army, caught off guard by this sudden reversal, faltered in their assault. The arrival of the Confort fleet had completely turned the tide of the battle. For the Iron Islands defenders, the arrival of the Confort fleet was the only beacon of hope, fueling their desperate final stand. For the Solon army, however, this was a dire warning. If the Confort reinforcements successfully landed, the Solonians risked being caught in a pincer maneuver. Solon officers roared, driving their troops to crush the harbor resistance before the fleet could dock. The Solon reserve surged forward like a black tide, wave after wave crashing against the crumbling defense line. The battle reached a fever pitch as the Solonians abandoned all caution, employing brutal, all-out assault tactics. Armored berserkers formed an assault wedge, pushing through the defenders' sparse arrows to strike at the weakest point in the line. Their battle axes and flails shattered everything in their path, tearing through both defenders and their weapons. "Hold them back. Use the naphtha," Knight Klein screamed, his face covered in blood. Defenders rushed the berserkers, hurling jars of precious naphtha at their feet. Flames erupted, but a burning berserker roared and threw his giant axe, bisecting a defender. Another berserker, ignoring the fire, grabbed a young defender and crushed his throat. A teenage boy, driven by the sight of his comrade's death, grabbed a burning torch and strapped a jar of naphtha to his own body. "Little Jack, no!" a veteran cried out, but it was too late. The boy dodged a sweeping axe, tackled the burning berserker, and ignited the naphtha on his own chest. A muffled explosion consumed both. The berserker collapsed in agony, and the boy was reduced to ash. This horrific sacrifice stunned both sides, slowing the Solon advance and hardening the defenders' resolve. At sea, the Solon flagship, damaged and mastless, was pushed out of its berth by Solon sailors. Though unable to sail, the Solon commander intended to use the wreck as a blockade or a stationary gun platform to delay the Carnford fleet. Baron Werner, watching from the high platform, immediately recognized the threat. If the narrow channel was blocked, the Carnford fleet could not dock, and all hope would be lost. "Order every ship. Ram it. Burn it. Stop that ship at any cost," Werner shouted, his voice cracking. The order reached the remaining Iron Islands warships, mostly small, battered merchant vessels and galleys. Despite their condition, the sailors shared the same suicidal resolve as their comrades on land. Raise sails. Row. For the Iron Islands. For survival. 5 or 6 surviving ships turned and launched a desperate, suicidal charge against the massive Solon flagship. "Fire! Stop them!" the Solon officer on the flagship screamed. Solon archers unleashed a rain of arrows from the high gunnels. Cannons roared, sending solid shots splashing into the sea. Iron Island sailors fell, and a lead boat was obliterated by a direct cannon hit. The remaining ships pressed on, weaving through the barrage to close the distance. "Boarding!" the captain of the first ship roared as they finally collided with the flagship. Survivors scrambled up grappling hooks or leaped onto the enemy deck for a brutal close-quarters fight. Brendan stood like a rock on the north wind, assessing the chaotic battlefield. The harbor defense was failing, the Iron Islands Navy was sacrificing itself, and more Solon ships were closing in. "Order all transport ships and medium warships to turn and dock at any cost to evacuate the survivors," Brendan commanded. "North Wind, Sea Lion, and Aegis, with me. We intercept the Solon fleet to buy time." Signals were sent, and horns blared across the water. The fleet split. The smaller Grim Chamber of Commerce transports raced toward the burning docks to pick up survivors. The North Wind, Sea Lion, and Aegis turned to engage the Solon main fleet and their flagship. "Aim for the flagship. Left broadside, fire," Captain Jackson roared from the North Wind. The cannons thundered. A hail of hot iron slammed into the turning Solon flagship. The flagship abandoned the small boats to return fire with its heavy cannon. A massive explosion echoed. The North Wind shuddered violently, as wood splintered. A solid shot tore through the North Wind's hull above the waterline, smashing into the lower gun deck. "Damage report," I demanded, steadying myself. "Number 3 gun destroyed. 5 dead. Taking on water," came the reply. My face darkened, but I remained resolute. "Keep firing. Suppress them." The Sea Lion and Aegis joined the fray, forming a pincer around the crippled Solon flagship. They unleashed a barrage of chain shot to shred the rigging and solid shot to shatter the hull. Under the three-way assault, the flagship slowed, burning and battered. The Carnford fleet seized control of the naval engagement. At the harbor, the arrival of the Carnford transports sparked a frenzy. The desperate crowd surged forward, survival instinct overriding all discipline. "The ship is here. Get on. Move. Let me on first. My child. My child is still behind." The crowd surged toward the pier like a broken dam. Amidst the screams and shoving, the soldiers maintaining order were nearly overwhelmed. People shoved others into the ICC just to board first, exposing the raw selfishness and desperation of the moment. "Hold the line. Anyone who charges the boarding team will be executed," Baron Werner roared, personally charging into the chaos and using the back of his blade to beat back the panicked crowd. I knew that if order collapsed, the resulting stampede or capsized boats would doom everyone. "For your children. Hold the line if you want your families to live. There are plenty of ships," But if the Solonians break through, no one survives. Knight Klein yelled, his eyes bloodshot as he led his remaining men against the intensifying Solonian assault. Perhaps due to the threat of death or the sight of more ships approaching, the chaos subsided slightly. Under the threat of steel and the officers' organization, the crowd formed a ragged line and began boarding amidst tears and curses. Sailors and soldiers on the docked transport ships opened fire with muskets and bows, suppressing the Solonian army attacking the pier. Though inaccurate, the dense rain of projectiles caused significant casualties and disruption among the Solonians, easing the pressure on the defenders. Faster, faster, the captains urged. They knew their comrades at sea were buying them time with their lives, and every second lost increased the danger. Weber and his squad sprinted through the burning ruins and smoke-filled alleys. Avoiding main roads, they navigated narrow, hidden paths toward the port, guided by Weber's memory and sound. They narrowly avoided several Solonian patrols, some passing just feet from their hiding spots. Surprisingly, the Solonians ignored them. They were too focused on the port, shouting in their own language and rushing forward, indifferent to the mice escaping the shanty town. "Boss, why aren't they chasing us?" Tom whispered, panting as he supported Mia. Weber listened. The dull thuds of Solonian artillery were now mixed with the crisp, rhythmic broadsides of the Conford fleet. "It's the fleet. The Conford fleet is here, engaging the Solonians," Weber whispered, his eyes bright with sudden hope. "The Solonian main force is drawn to the pier. They're racing against time and ignoring us. This is our chance." The news acted as a stimulant, renewing the group's strength. They pushed through the maze of the shanty town and emerged into a burning, sparse forest on the outskirts of the port. Hiding behind trees and slopes, they gasped for air and looked toward the harbor. The sight made them gasp. The entire port was a boiling battlefield of blood and flesh. The pier's defenses were shattered, with only a few isolated pockets of resistance left. The defenders were outnumbered, surrounded, and fighting for their lives like a boat in a storm. Corpses piled up, and the seawater around the pier was stained dark red. At sea, Conford transport ships were departing, riddled with arrows and damage. Further out, the three massive warships, Northwind, Sea Lion, and Aegis, were locked in a fierce exchange with a larger number of Solonian vessels. Muzzle flashes lit the night, and shells sent massive water spouts into the air. The Northwind, despite a visible hole in its hull, stubbornly blocked the Solonian ships. A heavy ship, sitting too low to dock, remained in the outer harbor, providing covering fire for the pier. Countless small boats shuttled between the heavy ship and the pier, each carrying a dozen people to safety. Every broadside from the heavy ship decimated the Solonians near the pier, buying precious time. But the pier was on the verge of collapse. The defenders were dwindling, and the heavy ship couldn't wait forever. "It's over. The pier is falling. How do we get across?" Jenny sobbed. One held her tightly, pale-faced, while Eric and the others trembled. Weber forced himself to remain calm, his eyes scanning the battlefield. The front was a suicide mission, and the left was blocked by steep reefs. Weber locked onto the right side of the pier, a storage area for debris and broken ships. It was less defended, and the Solonians were distracted by the main battle. "Look there," Weber whispered, pointing. "Few Solonians. We charge there, hit the pier, and grab a boat. But there are still enemies. How do we cross that open ground?" Tom asked, swallowing hard. "No time to hesitate," Weber said sharply. "The pier won't hold, and the ship won't wait. This is our only chance." I looked at my battered companions. "Listen, on three, we sprint in a straight line to that broken pier. Don't stop. Don't look back. If someone falls, keep going. Our lives depend on this." I looked at the weak Mia. "Keep her in the middle. Go." Seeing the burning pier and the ship of hope, their desire to live overcame their fear. They gripped their crude weapons, their eyes burning with a final, desperate resolve. I took a deep breath. 1, 2, 3, charge. I bolted from the shadows like an arrow, followed by Tom, Jenny, Mia, and the others, launching a desperate sprint toward our final hope. Their fate would be decided in the next few seconds. My judgment was correct. The Solonians were focused on the main battle, leaving the right side of the port largely undefended. Only a few wounded Solonians patrolled the area, their attention fixed on the main conflict. Faster. Follow me, I growled, sprinting low past piles of broken barrels and discarded fishing nets. Tom, Jenny, Eric, and the others followed, hearts pounding, using their final reserves of strength to keep pace with me. A Solon soldier resting by a wrecked ship spotted them and shouted, reaching for his spear. Weber ignored him, rushing past. Tom struck the soldier down with his makeshift cane, and the group swept through the Solon defense line like a whirlwind. With minimal resistance, Weber's team pierced the Solonians' weak right flank and reached the pier. Before them lay a small, debris-filled bay. Jenny pointed toward a makeshift jetty. A crude raft made of logs and rope bobbed in the water. A stiff corpse of an Iron Islander lay on the raft, riddled with arrows, a victim of a failed escape attempt. This raft was their only hope. Weber jumped aboard, checking the ropes. Tom and Jenny hauled the exhausted Mia onto the raft, followed by Juan, Eric, and the others. The raft groaned under the weight of 8 people, sitting dangerously low in the water. I slashed the blood-stained mooring rope with my short sword. Row. Use anything you can. Get away from the shore, I commanded, grabbing a broken oar. Tom, Juan, and the others began paddling with boards and their own arms. The raft drifted away from the jetty, but they had only cleared 20 meters when disaster struck. No, wait, come back, Tom cried out, pointing toward the horizon. The group looked and felt their hearts sink. The Carnford ship, their only hope for rescue, had raised its sails and was turning toward the open sea. It was abandoning them. No, don't leave us. The women screamed in despair as their last hope vanished. Suddenly, a whistling sound cut through the air. Solon archers on the shore had spotted them and unleashed a volley of arrows. I reacted instantly, lifting a thick board to shield the raft from the incoming fire. Thud, thud, thud. Arrows slammed into the wood. The impact numbed my arms, but the board held. Keep rowing. Get out of range, I warned. Driven by survival, the group paddled frantically, slowly widening the distance. The Solon archers fired 2 more volleys, but the arrows fell harmlessly into the sea behind them. They were temporarily safe. Yet, no one felt relief. They drifted aimlessly in the dark, vast ocean. The silhouette of the Carnford ship disappeared into the darkness, and the flashes of distant cannon fire. Despair washed over them like the freezing tide. It's over. The ship is gone. What do we do? Eric muttered blankly. Juan held his weeping wife, Jenny. Mia lay motionless in the center, and the other women sobbed. Even the resilient Tom hung his head, his eyes devoid of light. With no destination, returning to the Iron Islands meant death, and drifting meant starvation or drowning. They had escaped the fire only to face a wider, more hopeless void. I panted, setting down the arrow-pierced board. I looked at my companions, feeling the same void, but knew I could not give up. My gaze shifted to the horizon where the Carnford fleet was still engaged in a fierce battle against the Solon Navy. The flagship, North Wind, stood out amidst the cannon fire like a beacon of defiance. A thought struck me. We aren't chasing that ship, I announced, breaking the silence. I stared at the North Wind, a flicker of resolve returning to my eyes. Then where are we going? Tom asked. I pointed toward the center of the raging battle. There, to the North Wind. My words reignited the group's fading spirits. Yes, the North Wind, and the Sea Lion and Aegis. They're still fighting, Tom exclaimed, trembling with excitement. They are warships. They won't give up easily. If we reach them, there's hope. Juan added, his eyes burning with intensity. Even Mia opened her eyes, looking toward the roaring battle. Row. Adjust course for the North Wind. With everything you have, I commanded, steering the raft. The others shook off their exhaustion, using every available object to paddle toward the battle. The small raft turned, struggling toward the towering, fire-lit silhouette of the North Wind. Tom suddenly gasped, pointing at the surrounding sea. My God! Look, it's not just us. Everyone is heading that way. The group looked, stunned. Across the dark, churning sea, countless faint lights and shadows were converging from all directions toward the 3 Carnford warships, North Wind, Sea Lion, and Aegis. They were hundreds of makeshift rafts, planks, and even barrels, all packed with survivors. Some carried torches, flickering like fireflies in the dark. These were the final survivors of the Iron Islands, those left behind or escaped from the shantytown. They were all racing toward the warships, the only symbols of hope left in the blood-soaked sea. It was a haunting, epic sight. Thousands of tiny specks forming a desperate, determined torrent toward the heart of the conflict. Waves constantly battered the fragile vessels, tossing people into the freezing water. Yet, even those who fell overboard continued to struggle, swimming toward the warships with their last ounce of strength. Many were swallowed by the waves, yet others stubbornly pressed toward their goal. They all thought of it. Jenny watched the apocalyptic scene, tears streaming down her face as she choked back sobs. These were not tears of fear, but of awe at the collective will to survive. Row, don't get left behind. Don't let the waves flip us. Weber shook off his shock, his voice raspy from exertion as he rowed harder. He knew this wasn't a race, but a collective migration against death. The closer they got to the warships, the better their chances. Their raft was merely a drop in this tragic torrent. Without further words, the instinct to survive gave everyone infinite strength. Tom, Juan, Eric, and even the three fragile women bit their lips and rowed with everything they had. Jenny tended to Mia while using a small board to row. Their raft picked up speed, merging into the desperate fleet of survivors. The sea was filled with the roar of waves, distant cannon fire, Solonian shouts, cries for help, and desperate cheers. Row. Keep rowing. I see the ships. Right ahead. Hold on. Don't give up. This was an unprecedented mass escape born from a war-torn purgatory, the most primal, stubborn, and moving display of life facing annihilation. Ahead, the three Conford warships, like fortresses on the sea, seemed to sense the desperate calls. The north wind adjusted its firing angle, clearing Solonian speedboats and using side cannons and muskets to suppress Solon archers targeting the survivors. Relying on instinct and luck, Weber's team navigated the debris and struggling masses, finally reaching the side of the towering north wind. Up close, the ship's hull was like a steep cliff, casting a massive shadow. Its gun ports and battle scars were visible, and the air reeked of gunpowder, blood, and brine. Yet, proximity did not mean safety. The north wind was moving. Its massive oars churned, sails caught the wind, and it slowly turned to retreat while firing its broadside cannons at the pursuing Solonians. It could not stop for scattered refugees. They had to climb aboard the moving giant themselves. Throw the rope up. Now, Weber roared at Tom, hurling their only sturdy rope, tipped with an iron hook, upward. The hook hit the hull and slid down twice. On the third try, Weber put his entire strength into the throw, and with a metallic clang, the hook caught on a protrusion. It caught. Tom cheered, but the rope suddenly went slack and slipped. Just as despair set in, a soot-covered, exhausted Conford sailor peered over the railing, spotting the struggling survivors. Grab it. Come up. The ship won't stop. The sailor caught the falling rope, lashed it securely to a cleat, and waved them on. Go, Weber shouted, testing the rope before ordering his team to climb one by one. Joy flooded the raft. Jenny wept with relief. One hugged his wife, and even the weak Mia found hope. They had finally grabbed the lifeline to escape this hell for the safety of Conford. But fate is cruel. Just as Tom prepared to climb, boom! A massive, wall-like wave slammed into the raft, shattering it instantly. The rope pulled taut. Hold the rope. Mia! Screams and the sound of splintering would fill the air. Weber was submerged, the immense tension nearly tearing his arms from his sockets. I bit my teeth, refusing to let go. Tom, Juan, and the others instinctively clung to the rope or each other. Seconds later, 7 or 8 heads surfaced, coughing and gasping. Miraculously, no one was lost, though the raft was now just floating debris. Relief was replaced by deeper fear. We were now submerged in freezing water, hanging from the side of a moving warship by a single rope. Every wave hit like a hammer, threatening to pull us into the abyss. Cold and exhaustion were now more lethal than Solonian blades. Hold on. Don't let go. Weber roared, pulling the weak Mia close, wrapping one arm around her and using my other hand and teeth to secure the rope. The others clung to one another, using their remaining strength to fight the waves. Around us, a more tragic scene unfolded. Countless refugees on rafts and driftwood surged toward the north wind, Sea Lion, and Aegis. The warships, unable to stop, threw down ropes, ladders, and nets in a desperate humanitarian effort. Grab the ladder. Climb. The ship won't stop. Sailors leaned over the rails, shouting and reaching out to pull survivors aboard. The strong and lucky managed to grab the ladders and began to climb. Others, sapped of strength, fell from the ladders, vanishing into the wake. Worse, those in the path of the warships were crushed instantly by the hulls. It was a high-stakes, inefficient rescue where life and death hung by a thread. Weber looked at the purgatory around us, then at his exhausted, injured team. My flicker of hope was extinguished by the cold reality. Climbing was impossible. We were too injured and drained to even hold the rope, let alone scale a swaying ladder. We can't make it," Tom whispered, his teeth chattering from the cold. Weber said nothing, wrapping the rope tighter around my wrists and holding me firmer. I looked up at the towering, moving hull with a mix of defiance and resigned calm. We had reached the threshold of hope, only to find we lacked the strength to cross it. Now, we could only cling to the rope, surrendering our fate to the ship, the sea, and a slim chance of luck. Would we reach the other side, or would we lose our grip and sink into the icy depths? The answer remained unknown. We held on, waiting for fate's verdict in the dark and cold. The main port of the Iron Islands, once chaotic and crowded, now lay in dead silence, broken only by crackling fires, distant screams, and the brutal cheers of victorious Solan soldiers. The air reeked of blood, ash, and brine. The ground was carpeted in dried blood and mangled corpses. Gron, commander of the Hound Legion, stood like a dark iron tower on a shattered pier. His iron-studded leather armor was scarred and blood-stained, his wolf-head pauldrons glinting menacingly in the firelight. Leaning on his blood-caked battle axe, he stared through the morning mist toward the empty southern horizon. The Carnford fleet and its swarm of smaller vessels had vanished completely. Only floating debris and corpses remained, evidence of the brutal escape from the previous night. A messenger knelt, reporting that the port was cleared and the shanty town was being mopped up. Full control of the island was expected by noon. Gron grunted in acknowledgement. Victory. The Iron Islands, a strategic gateway to the Northern Territory, now flew the wolf-head battle flag of Chieftain Harold. As the field commander, Gron had achieved a historic triumph for the tribe. Yet, he felt no joy, only a heavy, unshakable gloom. His eyes held a cold, calculating frustration. He turned to survey the chaotic port. Soldiers were clearing the battlefield, burning their own dead while discarding the Plantagenet defenders and civilians like refuse. The victory celebration was primitive and bloody. Looting, executions, and the cries of women echoing from burning buildings. Gron permitted this. It was the necessary cost of maintaining morale during a conquest. His soldiers needed to vent their rage and satisfy their greed. But Gron saw beyond the immediate spoils. They had secured the island, destroyed the local Plantagenet naval remnants, and seized supplies. The blow to Plantagenet prestige would deter the Valaya Principality. However, the primary goal, the annihilation of the enemy's manpower and skilled labor, had failed. The body count was far lower than expected. The Carnford fleet had successfully evacuated thousands of people, likely prioritizing the most valuable assets. Skilled craftsmen, sailors, and elite soldiers were now safely in Carnford, bolstering Lord I. Gron muttered the name Carl with a deepening scowl. This young lord had repeatedly thwarted Chieftain Harold and now snatched a massive population from under their noses. Carnford's strength would surge, potentially creating a formidable obstacle for the Solan tribe. The Pyrrhic victory left a bitter taste in his mouth. He envisioned Carnford using these resources to build a fleet and army that would block their path south. His adjutant approached, asking how to handle the remaining captives. The implication was clear. The soldiers wanted a massacre. Gron looked at the ongoing atrocities with cold indifference. Cleansing the island of potential resistance was standard northern practice. Follow the usual rules, Gron said. Secure the craftsmen and young women. Do as you please with the rest. But restore the port's function quickly. We need this as a supply base. The adjutant saluted and left with a bloodthirsty grin. Gran ignored the screams, his gaze returning to the southern sea. The battle for the Iron Islands was over, but a greater struggle had begun. Eye of Carnford had become a high-priority threat. He pondered whether to push south or turn back to eliminate this new rival. Gran pulled his axe from the wood and shouldered it. This dilemma was no longer his to solve. He had fulfilled his mission. Dealing with Carnford was a matter for Chieftain Harold and his advisors. He would write his report and enjoy the spoils of victory. The war was far from over. He walked toward the carnage, the conqueror of a ruined paradise. 2 days and 2 nights. For Weber's squad, trailing the north wind in the freezing sea, these 76 hours were an agonizing endurance test. Every second was a battle against cold, hunger, injury, and the terror of death. Mia's infection, Juan's leg injury, and the other's exhaustion made climbing the ship's rope ladder impossible. Weber and Tom dared not risk the climb, having seen others fall and be shredded by the ship's propellers. They could not abandon their companions. Their only hope was to cling to the rope and trust the ship. Fortunately, the sailors on the North Wind did not forget them. Despite the chaos on deck, sailors periodically lowered a bucket. It contained thin broth, rock-hard black bread, and cheap spirits to clean wounds. Using provided materials, Weber and Tom reinforced their makeshift raft to keep everyone partially out of the water. They suffered through scorching days and freezing nights. Mia's condition was dire. She remained mostly delirious, her wounds festering. Jenny and the other women tried to cool her fever with wet rags, but with little success. Juan's legs were swollen and shiny, and Eric's cough worsened. Everyone was at their breaking point, sustained only by the desperate hope that land was near. I lay on the raft, my limbs numb and consciousness fading from exhaustion and cold. I looked at Mia, lying in the center. Jenny tried to feed her water, but most trickled away. I touched Mia's burning forehead, my heart sinking. I knew she was fading. After surviving the brothel, the Solonians, and the sea, were we to lose her now? Suddenly, Mia's eyelashes fluttered, and she opened her eyes. She focused on my weary, worried face. She whispered weakly, "Weber, I'm in so much pain. I feel like I'm burning." I gripped her cold hand, unable to speak through my constricted throat. Mia offered a faint, resigned smile. "Thank you for bringing me this far. I can't go on. Seeing the calm sea is enough." Her words shattered me, and Jenny wept openly. "Don't say that. We're almost at the shore. There are doctors waiting," I urged, despite my own doubts. Mia shook her head, her gaze drifting as her strength failed. Just as despair threatened to consume them, a cry rang out. "Look! Land! It's Carnford. We've arrived." Tom, the lookout, stood up and shouted with every ounce of his remaining strength. He pointed toward the horizon, his shout jolting everyone from their despair. Everyone, including the fading Mia, looked toward the horizon where a massive landmass emerged from the morning mist. Familiar mountains, coastlines, and docks appeared. They had reached the sanctuary of Carnford. Giant Island, the gateway to the southwest peninsula. I choked out, tears streaming down my face. Jenny and Juan wept in each other's arms. Eric and the others embraced, while Mia's eyes flickered with a final, faint spark of life. The north wind slowed as the fleet approached the port, greeted by cheers from other vessels. Hope returned. I gripped Mia's hand, my voice firm. "Hear that, Mia? We're here. You'll be fine." The raft drifted toward the shore of rebirth. Though the future remained uncertain, they had survived. As the north wind entered the waters of Giant Island, Brendan exhaled a long-held breath of relief. He felt a profound sense of accomplishment and relief. He looked toward the coast, noting the island's transformation in just 2 days. Where there was once wilderness, rows of makeshift huts and earthen houses had sprouted. Wooden docks bustled with activity, and smoke rose from newly cleared fields. The air smelled of fresh soil, timber, and human life. Small boats and canoes swarmed out from the port to meet the fleet. Officials, doctors, and soldiers had been waiting for 2 days. Finally, home, Brendan murmured, his bloodshot eyes softening. He had completed the impossible task assigned by Lord Carl. A scribe approached with a report, his voice trembling with excitement. "Sir, the The second wave of Operation Hannibal has returned with over 4,900 people, including 1,200 from the rafts and barges. Combined with the 3,100 from the first wave, we have rescued 8,047 people from the Solon army. The number hit Brendan hard, weighing heavily on his conscience. He knew 12,000 others had been left behind to die on the burning islands. The rescue had come at a terrible cost, but these 8,000 survivors, veterans, craftsmen, and farmers, were the foundation for the future. Their arrival would revitalize Conford and shift the balance of power in the northern frontier. Operation Hannibal was a strategic success. Brendan recalled the hellish scenes of the evacuation. He inhaled deeply, his gaze sharpening once more. "Orders," he commanded, his voice carrying across the deck. "All ships dock in order. Women, children, and the wounded first. Soldiers last. The North Wind, Sea Lion, and Aegis will anchor in deep water. Priority: deploy all boats to rescue those on the rafts and barges immediately. They are the most vulnerable." His orders prioritized the humanity of those who had endured the worst. The fleet executed the plan, with small boats ferrying the survivors. Sailors carefully transferred the exhausted refugees to the boats. Many collapsed in tears the moment they touched solid ground. Brendan watched as a stretcher carrying an unconscious person was lifted aboard, feeling a glimmer of hope. He turned away from the landing site, looking toward the main city of Conford. His mission was done, but the real challenge was just beginning. Integrating 8,000 new mouths to feed would be the next great task for Lord Carl and the scribe Edgar. But that was a matter for another day. Brendan watched the survivors he brought home step onto the new land. Sea breezes brushed my face, and seagulls circled above the sunlit water. Seeing the giant island coastline, the refugees' patience vanished, replaced by a desperate instinct to reach land. "Untie the ropes. We'll row ourselves," Weber roared, unwilling to wait another second for rescue boats. Tom fumbled with the knot securing the raft to the north wind, finally biting and pulling it free. As the raft drifted, Weber grabbed a broken plank. "Row. Row hard." Tom, Juan, Jenny, and the three injured women frantically paddled with whatever they could find. Even Mia, delirious with fever, seemed to sense the final push, her lips moving silently in encouragement. The small raft, carrying 9 broken souls, surged toward the shore with desperate determination. Fatigue and pain forgotten, the raft finally slammed into the soft sand. "We made it." Tom jumped off, sinking into the warm sand. He collapsed, laughing and sobbing in a mix of relief and exhaustion. The others struggled off the raft. Jenny helped Juan, while the other women supported the weak, coughing Eric. Everyone felt dizzy as they stepped onto solid ground. Weber remained on the raft to carefully lift Mia into his arms. She felt weightless, yet her burning fever scorched my chest through my clothes. "Weber, we're safe," Mia whispered, looking at the blue sky. "Yes," Weber replied steadily, his arms firm. "You're safe. I'm taking you to a doctor." I carried her through the shallows onto the beach. Mia looked up at my face. It was weathered, bearded, and scarred, a face that usually seemed fierce and unapproachable. To Mia, however, my wrinkles and scars now looked like medals of resilience. My sharp, bloodshot eyes offered a profound sense of security. I was the man who had pulled her from death's door. A warm, unfamiliar feeling flushed her cheeks, overriding her fever. Gratitude and dependency blossomed within her. In my arms, she felt unprecedented peace. The warmth was quickly extinguished by cold reality. She looked at my tattered uniform and felt my soldier's strength, contrasting it with her own past as a prostitute. They were worlds apart. Her gaze dimmed, her hope replaced by bitter humility. She buried her burgeoning feelings deep down. Surviving was enough. Resting her head on my shoulder, she whispered, "Thank you, Weber." The words held everything. She thanked me for her life and the fleeting warmth I provided. Weber, oblivious to her inner turmoil, scanned the chaotic beach for medical personnel. My only priority was getting her treated. I navigated the crowded beach like a man carrying a fragile treasure. Avoiding the stretcher teams and weeping families, I searched for a medical station. Near a small grove, I spotted tents marked with charcoal drawings of herbs and cups, a field hospital. A pungent stench of herbs, blood, pus, and cheap alcohol hit me. The tent was packed. Refugees and soldiers lay everywhere, their moans and coughs filling the air. Figures in gray robes and plague doctor masks moved among them. These masks, promoted by I, used charcoal and herbs to filter the air in the crowded space. I pushed inside, searching for someone in charge. I intercepted a plague doctor who had just finished bandaging a patient. "Doctor, please look at her," I rasped. Her wrist was nearly severed, severely infected after days in the sea. "She's had a high fever for 2 days. She needs debridement." The doctor, surprised by my use of professional terms like debridement, studied me. The man looked like a seasoned soldier, not a typical refugee, but there was no time for questions. The doctor nodded, signaling me to set her down. I placed Mia on a patch of dirty linen. The doctor unwrapped the blood-soaked bandages. A foul stench of necrosis filled the air, causing nearby patients to gag. Mia's wrist was a horrific sight, dark, swollen, and oozing yellow pus. The doctor didn't flinch. He examined the wound and checked Mia's flushed face and cracked lips. "Severe rot, sepsis, and a high fever," the doctor said, his voice muffled by the mask. "But the wound is clean enough. No major vessels or bones were severed. She'll live." My tension finally broke, and my clenched fists relaxed. The doctor pointed to a corner. "Move her there. I'll treat a pneumothorax case first, then I'll debride her wound." "Who is looking after her?" "I am," I replied immediately. The plague doctor gestured for Weber to proceed before moving to another soldier. "Thank you, doctor," Weber whispered, his voice trembling. I carefully moved Mia to the corner as instructed. Collapsing against a tent pole, I exhaled a long, ragged breath. Mia was alive, but the agony of debridement and the risk of infection remained. Watching the sunlight filter through the tent, I felt the weight of their situation. We had reached safety, but the true test had only just begun. Hearing the doctor's words, Mia's frayed nerves finally snapped. A wave of relief and exhaustion washed over her, nearly causing her to faint. She looked at the weary Weber and whispered, "Brother Weber." "Thank you." Weber turned, meeting her fever-bright eyes. I offered a faint, weary smile. That smile comforted Mia more than any words. "You've saved me so many times," Mia sobbed. "I have nothing left to repay you." I shook my head calmly. "Don't be foolish. Surviving together is fate. We're both newcomers in Confort," I added. "We need to find shelter and food. Supporting each other is our best chance." The words supporting each other struck a chord in Mia. Joy surged through her. Weber didn't see her as a burden, but as a companion for their struggle. She was no longer alone. She had someone to trust. The plague doctor returned with a tray of sterilized tools and linen. "Prepare for debridement," he announced. He handed Mia a bundle of dried grass. "Bite this, it will hurt." Mia trembled, looking to Weber for strength. I nodded firmly, offering silent reassurance. Mia bit down on the grass. "Cover her eyes," the doctor ordered, picking up a scalpel. I placed my calloused hand over Mia's eyes, plunging her into darkness. "Relax, it will be over soon," I murmured, gripping her hand tightly. My touch anchored her. My warmth acted as a sedative against her fear. She gripped my hand back, her knuckles white. The doctor began cutting away the necrotic tissue. MMPH. Agony tore through Mia. She convulsed, sweat soaking her clothes as she stifled a scream. I felt her body shake and heard her teeth grinding against the grass. I held her steady, pouring my strength into her. I remained a silent pillar of support while the doctor worked quickly. Each step of the procedure brought fresh spasms of pain. The world narrowed down to the sound of tools and Mia's ragged breathing. Finally, the doctor cleaned the wound and applied a pungent ointment. "The rot is gone," the doctor said, moving to the next patient. I removed my hand. Mia lay limp, drenched in sweat. Her eyes were clearer, and the fever seemed to have ebbed. She managed a weak, genuine smile at Weber. I exhaled, realizing I was soaked in sweat myself. I let go of her hand, seeing deep nail marks in my palm. The worst was over. We had survived the first hurdle. In the blood-scented tent, a bond of trust had been forged. As the last transport from the North Wind docked at Giant Island, Brendan felt a massive weight lift from his shoulders. He stepped onto the solid ground of the island last. The firm earth brought relief to the veteran soldier. He preferred land over the treacherous sea. Despite his exhaustion, he stood tall, surveying the dock. Refugees were being organized into temporary shelters. A sense of satisfaction washed over him. His mission was a success. A stir at the dock entrance caught his attention. A group of guards in chainmail approached. At their head was Lord I. Brendan straightened his uniform and adjusted his sword. He marched forward to greet Lord I. Officers and soldiers stood at attention, clearing a path as I arrived. Brendan stopped 5 paces away and saluted stiffly. My lord, Operation Hannibal is complete. The fleet and all evacuees have arrived safely at Giant Island. His voice was hoarse but clear. I observed Brendan's exhaustion, the grime on his uniform, and his bloodshot eyes. I returned the salute solemnly. My expression softened into a faint, sincere smile. Stepping forward, I patted Brendan's shoulder. Welcome home, General. You've done well, far beyond my expectations. You have rendered immortal service to Carnford. Brendan felt a surge of warmth, but remained humble. It was only possible through your trust, the grim chamber of commerce, and the efforts of my men. I brushed aside the modesty, my tone shifting to one of firm concern. Enough. You've been at sea, fighting for days without sleep. Even iron breaks under such strain. I pointed to a nearby stone house. Your task is done. Leave the rest to Edgar and me. That is my temporary quarters. Go get some sleep. That is an order. Brendan hesitated, feeling he should assist with the refugees. My lord, I can still execute the order, General. I interrupted gently but firmly. Carnford needs a rested leader, not a casualty. We have hard battles ahead. Rest is your priority. Seeing the genuine concern in my eyes, Brendan's resistance faded. Overwhelming exhaustion washed over him. He knew his limits had been reached. Understood. Thank you, my lord. Brendan saluted again. I nodded to a guard. Escort the general. No one is to disturb him. Yes, my lord. Brendan cast one last look at the busy docks before following the guard toward the stone house. Inside, the noise of the refugee camp faded away. He bolted the door, unbuckled his sword, and collapsed onto the bed. The relief of mission completion hit him like a hammer. Sleep claimed him instantly. Soon, his rhythmic, salt and smoke-scented breathing filled the room. In a converted warehouse, I met the final survivors of the Iron Islands, Baron Werner and Knight Klein. As they entered, I scrutinized them. Despite their efforts to tidy up, their deep fatigue remained visible. Werner was pale, his armor scarred and blood-stained, his gait heavy. Klein looked equally weary, his eyes reflecting the shock of their lost homeland. I acknowledged their courage. Staying behind to hold the line showed true character. It proved they were not merely self-serving, but possessed the duty of true soldiers. Their performance earned my tentative trust. Such men were worth investing in. Werner and Klein observed the young lord in return. They were startled by his youth. I looked barely 20, with a youthful face and modest build. Yet, my gaze was sharp, steady, and possessed an unnerving, mature depth. I carried an air of natural authority. They saluted respectfully. Baron Werner and Knight Klein, reporting to Lord Karl. I smiled warmly. Baron, Knight, I have heard much of you. Please rise. Your defense of the Iron Islands against such odds, buying time for the evacuation, is truly admirable. My words acknowledged their service while addressing their current status as displaced leaders. Werner replied humbly, You are too kind, my lord. We only did our duty. We are forever in your debt for saving our people. Klein echoed the sentiment. I moved straight to the point, knowing they needed purpose more than empty words. I gestured to a map. The loss of the Iron Islands was inevitable, but your courage is a valuable asset. Pointing to the southwest peninsula, I continued. Because of your sacrifice, we saved 8,000 souls. To honor your service and prepare for the war against Solon. I looked them in the eye, my voice resonant. I, Karl von Schmidt, Lord of Carnford, hereby declare. I grant the Blue Reef Islands to Baron Werner. You are now the Baron of Blue Reef Islands. Build us a maritime shield. I pointed to another area. And the ink marched to Knight Klein. Use your skills to cultivate and defend our inland borders. The two men were stunned, their eyes wide with shock and joy. They hadn't expected such immediate, generous rewards, land and titles, upon arrival. This gave them a foundation and a future within Carnford. My lord, Werner's voice trembled with emotion as they bowed deeply. Your trust is a second life to us. We swear to govern these lands, train our men, and serve as your shield until death. I accepted their salute with a gentle yet firm smile, promising rewards for their merit as Carnford sought talent. I tasked them with pacifying their old troops and recruiting refugees to turn the Blue Reef Islands and Ink Marsh into the Southwest Peninsula's southeastern gateway. My tone was sincere, but my eyes held deep calculation regarding these land grants. The Blue Reef Islands required naval expertise, playing to Werner's strengths, but their location sat strategically between the Carnford main fleet at Amber Bay and the peninsula. The Ink Marsh was difficult to develop, forcing Klein to tackle a tough task, while positioning him within the semicircle of Brendan's Heligoland Valley, Roland's East Territory, and Richter's South Bay. This was not malice, but mature political balancing. By granting benefits while placing powerful new forces within a controlled framework, I ensured stability and prevented future insubordination. Werner and Klein were smart enough to eventually realize the strategic implications of their placement. Yet, they had no room to complain. In chaotic times, receiving protected, legal land was a blessing. Such containment was merely the standard expectation of a lord. I shifted my tone, informing them that my land grants came with strict Carnford obligations. I demanded they surrender all private troops brought from the Iron Islands to be integrated into the Carnford Standing Army. Carnford had no tradition of vassals keeping private armies. All military recruitment, training, and command belonged solely to the lord. The military was the sword and shield of the state, not a tool for personal power. Regarding governance, I mandated that all tax and judicial matters follow Carnford law, with officials appointed by my lord's manor. The vassals could not set taxes or hold private courts. Their income would derive strictly from land rents and profits from resources like mines or fisheries. Finally, I clarified that while they held management and hereditary rights, ultimate ownership remained with Carnford. Treason or severe dereliction of duty would result in the forfeiture of their fiefs. Werner and Klein were shocked, exchanging glances of dismay. This was far from the independent autonomy they had envisioned. They were effectively being reduced to high-ranking stewards or honorary landlords. Yet, the cold reality quickly stifled their dissatisfaction. They were refugees, hunted by Solonians, with only a few hundred remnants left. They were now under the protection of Lord Karl, whose prestige was at its peak after defeating the Solon army. Resistance was suicidal against Carnford's superior forces. Choosing survival and hereditary status over the uncertainty of the sea was the only logical path. They recognized the necessity of the situation. They bowed respectfully, pledging absolute obedience to Carnford's laws. Satisfied, I directed them to my administrator, Edgar, for the paperwork, then invited them to dine and rest in their new home. Days later, I turned to my core followers, starting with Brendan. As the de facto second-in-command, Brendan was indispensable. He had spearheaded breakthroughs at the Tyrol campaign and led the Hannibal operation to rescue 8,000 refugees. He held the respect of the infantry, cavalry, and the nascent navy. His merit was unmatched. I granted him the fertile Heligoland Valley and promoted him to Baron. This land was a strategic gateway to the peninsula's interior. Entrusting it to Brendan was both a reward and a heavy defensive responsibility. No one in the inner circle contested this. Next was Roland, whose performance at Tyrol was exceptional. He had successfully built the Tyrol Regiment, a vital new force in Carnford's defense. I, however, remained cautious regarding his promotion. Roland was too young. Promoting him to Baron now would leave little room for future rewards, risking political friction. Instead, I granted him the Mirror Lake region and Eastern Hills as a hereditary knight's fief. This was a generous reward that left room for future advancement. Richter's reward fulfilled a long-standing promise of loyalty. Richter had been a low-level officer in France City when I first arrived in the north in dire straits. Richter had bet on my potential, bringing 30 men to join me with Count Rockefort's permission. I had never forgotten this early support. I now named Richter a Knight of the Plantagenet Kingdom and granted him lands along South Bay. This honored both his intelligence work and his early, unwavering loyalty. Finally, I rewarded my chief administrator, Edgar, for his tireless work in rebuilding and logistics. Since civil officials were not typically knighted, I named him Honorary Baron for Life of Spruce Town, granting him the town and its surrounding lands. I granted my core officials land revenues and honors, securing their loyalty and dedication without making titles hereditary. For my veteran followers, my rewards focused on comfort and symbolism. Engineer Maul, a foundational figure who built Carnford's defenses, was now elderly and had trained many successors. I granted him a lifetime noble status in the scenic Silver Sand Bay, signaling that Carnford rewards its meritorious servants. Finance Officer Hans, though lacking exceptional talent, was a loyal veteran. I granted him fertile land near the oak forest to honor our shared history. Leon, a northern frontier noble, had lost his ancestral lands to the Solon invasion. Having twice crippled the Solon cavalry at Tyrol, he had proven his worth. I granted him land near Elson Valley to serve as the foundation for his family's restoration. This gift was deeply meaningful to Leon, explaining his emotional reaction. Thorstein, a former enemy commander, had proven his loyalty through combat, but remained a sensitive figure. To maintain internal balance, I granted him the Silver Pine Forest without a new title. This was a measured reward that recognized his merit without causing political friction. Baron Werner and Knight Klein joined with their own troops, bolstering Carnford's strength. I confirmed Werner's title and granted him the Blue Reef Islands. I confirmed Klein's status and granted him the Ink Marsh. These grants formally integrated them into the Carnford system. Through these grants, I transformed my core team from employees into shareholders tied to the territory's success. They gained hereditary land income and social status. Yet, I retained the core of true power. Military command, taxation, and justice remained under the Lord's direct control, and land ownership remained conditional. Officials were required to reside in the Carnford main city, leaving their lands to be managed by stewards. This Carnford model was a mechanism for shared interests under strict centralization. It satisfied the ambition of my followers while preventing the regional fragmentation typical of feudalism. All recipients understood their wealth and status depended entirely on my authority. Consequently, they accepted these restrictions with gratitude. Late July, year 1 of Sigmund I, new fiefs in the Southwest Peninsula. Chaos on Giant Island subsided as the last refugees were transported to the Southwest Peninsula. Over 8,000 survivors from the Iron Islands were stabilized through Carnford's efficient administration and resource allocation. Despite a few deaths from severe wounds, the survival rate was miraculous. A mass grave was dug on the coast of Giant Island, marked by a granite monument. A veteran stonemason carved, "Iron Island's souls rest here. The living move forward." The group then migrated into the interior of the Southwest Peninsula. Order returned as the refugees began clearing land, building homes, and farming. The 8,000 refugees now had clear assignments and goals. Their immediate priority was building shelter before winter. They relied on the Lord's manor for food, racing against time to survive. Chief Administrator Edgar implemented a temporary governance system to ensure stability. He utilized the Baojia Collective Responsibility System, emphasizing wartime control. Edgar knew these refugees from the Iron Islands were a complex, disconnected population in a remote region. A networked management system was necessary to ensure mutual supervision. Orders were issued to the vassals for immediate execution. First, a census was conducted, recording every individual's background and skills. Households were organized into groups of 10 jia and 100 bao, each with an appointed leader. Leaders were chosen from among the refugees, those with prior status or skills. They received extra rations and authority to ensure their loyalty to the new order. These leaders held significant responsibilities. They managed household records, public order, labor, and future tax collection. The collective responsibility rule dictated that if one household broke the law, the entire group was punished. Serious crimes like treason or harboring spies would result in severe collective penalties, including exile or forced labor. This harsh rule forced neighbors to monitor each other, increasing the cost of descent. Edgar and I knew this fear-based system had clear drawbacks. It risked corruption and suppressed social vitality, making it unsustainable long-term. It was a temporary measure intended to transition into the more cohesive Tunbeo system once stability was achieved. Thus, across the Southwest Peninsula, the refugees were registered and organized under the new Baojia system. Newly appointed local officials, identified by simple badges, began organizing the refugees, counting heads, setting up camps, and assigning tasks. Men to logging and stone quarrying, women and the elderly to weaving and cooking. Despite the harsh conditions, the camp maintained a strict, organized order. The refugees worked for survival and to avoid punishment, balancing cooperation with a subtle, underlying wariness. While coercive, this system effectively stabilized the chaotic post-war period, organized production, and created an invisible defense against internal unrest and external infiltration. It provided Conford a vital buffer period to absorb the massive influx of population. Under Conford's efficient administration, the registration, screening, and distribution of over 8,000 refugees were nearly complete. In the temporary camps, people packed their meager belongings, said goodbye to their neighbors, and prepared to follow guides to the lands that would dictate their futures. The members of Weber's squad also faced their moment of separation. A few days of rest and adequate food had improved their health, but the air was thick with the sorrow of parting. Juan and his wife, Jenny, were the first to be assigned. Juan's leg had been saved, but he was permanently disabled and required a cane, rendering him unfit for military duty. They, along with 3 other women needing protection, were assigned to Old Moore's fief, Silver Sand Bay. With its mild climate and coastal location, Silver Sand Bay was an ideal, stable home for disabled veterans and families under the kind-hearted Old Moore. Weber, Tom, Eric, Mia, "We're leaving for Silver Sand Bay," Juan said, his voice heavy with uncertainty and reluctance. Jenny clung to her husband, weeping as she bid the others farewell. "Live well there. I hear Mr. Moore is a kind man, and the coast is a good place to avoid hunger," Weber comforted him steadily. Tom and Eric hugged Juan tightly, wishing him well. Weber then announced their own destination. "The 4 of us are assigned to Baron Brendan's Heligoland Valley." Tom and the recovered Eric were visibly excited. Heligoland Valley was the largest, most fertile land in the Southwest Peninsula, offering the most potential for growth. Serving under the Lord's favorite, Baron Brendan, promised a bright future. Mia, however, felt a mix of joy and deep anxiety. She approached Weber, pleading earnestly. "Weber, I know my hand is ruined and I can't do heavy labor, but I can wash, cook, and sew. Please, let me come to Heligoland with you." Blushing, she added in a trembling voice, "I can serve as a dependent or a servant. I just want to follow you to repay your kindness. I promise not to be a burden." Mia lowered her head, her face burning. The group fell silent. Tom and Eric stared, with Tom offering a knowing, suggestive smirk. Weber looked at the thin, resilient woman, remaining silent for a moment. He understood the implications of her request and the potential inconvenience of bringing her along. Yet, recalling her tenacity throughout their journey and seeing the desperate hope in her eyes, his resolve softened. "Fine," Weber said flatly. "Heligoland is large. 1 more person won't matter. If you want to come, come. We're used to each other. We can look out for one another." Though he didn't address her status, his acceptance caused Mia's eyes to light up with incredible joy. Her pale face flushed, and she seemed to come alive. To her, this was the best possible answer. She was accepted into their group, providing her a foundation for the future. "Hey," Tom nudged Weber, whispering with a wink. "Boss, you're something." "Used to each other? Heligoland is going to be lively." Weber glanced at him coldly, but a faint smile touched his lips as he began packing. Eric laughed and joined in. The final farewell was emotional. The group hugged Juan, Jenny, and the 3 women, who had bonded deeply through their shared trauma. "Mia, you're lucky to be with Weber. You'll have a good life," they said. Mia wept, holding their hands. "Take care of yourselves. Silver Sand Bay isn't far. We'll see each other again." They promised to visit, their despair replaced by a glimmer of hope for the future. "Let's go," Weber said, shouldering his pack. The 4 joined the flow of people heading south, while Juan and the others turned east towards Silver Sand Bay. As the sun set, the former survivors of the Iron Islands were scattered across Conford like dandelion seeds. Their individual ships of fate sailed toward different harbors. Days later, the Conford Castle office was buzzing with activity. I sat at the head of the table, flanked by Edgar, Brendan, Roland, and the newly infeft Baron Werner and Knight Klein. Despite their new lands, these core vassals remained based in Conford for central decision-making. Edgar reported on the refugee resettlement. The 8,000 refugees have been distributed to their respective fiefs and are currently building winter shelters under local supervision. Management frameworks are in place, and our craftsmen are guiding the construction of collective longhouses to ensure no one freezes before the snows. He noted that construction standards varied, which was problematic for long-term defense. I turned to the elderly Mr. Moore. How is the training of your Ministry of Livelihood engineering students? The first 50 have mastered basic surveying and construction and are ready for duty, Mr. Moore replied. Good, I said. Form them into technical teams and send them to key areas like Heligoland Valley, the Ink Marsh, and the Blue Reef Islands. Do not just build shacks. Plan for Tunbeo, concentrate housing, reserve space for defensive walls and arrow towers, and ensure water and grain stores are defensible. A little extra effort now will allow these settlements to become military strongpoints later. Understood, my lord, Mr. Moore replied, admiring my foresight. Edgar then addressed the grain situation. The 8,000 new mouths are a massive burden. We need nearly 1 million pounds of grain for relief until next summer's harvest. The room grew tense. The vassals were concerned for their fief's stability. I remained calm. What is the outlook after the autumn harvest? Edgar calculated quickly. If the harvest is successful, we will have a surplus of about 1 million pounds after providing relief. I warned that while there was a surplus, they must not grow complacent. I insisted on preparing for war and refused to support idlers. I directed Edgar to implement work for relief. Able-bodied men would build forts and roads, while women and the elderly would handle weaving, tanning, and logistics. I ordered Edgar and Maul to draft specific projects, emphasizing that food must be traded for stronger defenses and better infrastructure, not wasted. Edgar agreed, promising to draft a plan to ensure every grain of food and every ounce of labor served as a foundation for their future. Werner and Klein admired my shrewdness in balancing civil stability with long-term governance. Brendan reported that the Tyrol Regiment was fully formed, consisting of 2,500 men organized into 3 infantry battalions. Equipped to the 1st Regiment standards, the force comprised 70% spearmen and 30% musketeers, with Miller appointed as commander. I noted that Conford's standing army, including reserves and navy, now totaled nearly 8,000, with over 10,000 available if militia were mobilized. This strength significantly bolstered Conford's status in the northern frontier. Brendan suggested a defense adjustment, noting that Sir Lawrence troops from France City still garrisoned Tyrol Fortress. He proposed that the Tyrol Regiment take over, allowing Lawrence men to return home and asserting Conford's sovereignty over the territory. I agreed on the strategic necessity, but insisted on careful communication with Count Rochefort to avoid diplomatic friction. I instructed Edgar to draft a formal, humble, yet firm letter to Count Rochefort, thanking Sir Laurent and proposing the handover. Edgar accepted the order. I confirmed the Tyrol Regiment would garrison the fortress, calling it the vital gateway to the southwest peninsula. Brendan acknowledged. I shifted the focus to their strategic weakness, the Navy. I leaned forward, gesturing toward the sea on the map. I credited the success of Operation Hannibal to the fleet's efforts. I warned that without a strong navy, they were vulnerable. They had been lucky against the Solonians, but could not rely on luck again. I declared that the era of relying on small cogs and caravels was over. They needed ocean-going warships capable of carrying heavy cannons and securing maritime dominance. Edgar confirmed he had consulted with the Grim Chamber of Commerce and the Shipwrights Guild. With the addition of Iron Island's craftsmen and local timber, they were fully capable of building large carracks. These ships, the former backbone of the Royal Navy, could carry dozens of cannons and were ready for immediate construction. I ordered resources prioritized for the Navy to ensure a carrack fleet was built as quickly as possible. I then turned to the sensitive matter of personnel. I noted that Werner and Klein's troops contained skilled sailors essential for their naval ambitions. Werner and Klein realized their veteran sailors were being targeted for integration. My plan for these men was indirect but firm. I insisted they must first be integrated into Conford's system. I ordered all former Iron Islands naval personnel to join the Tyrol Regiment for at least 3 months of infantry training and discipline. Brendan understood, noting the regiment needed experienced veterans to train new recruits. He promised to instill Conford's military laws and loyalty, purging any lingering factionalism or old habits. Only after passing these rigorous standards would they be transferred to the Navy. The message was clear: indoctrination before deployment to ensure absolute loyalty. Werner and Klein exchanged looks, accepting the inevitable. They realized their troops no longer belonged to them. In these chaotic times, soldiers followed whoever paid their wages. Loyalty had naturally shifted to me. Grateful to retain their titles and lands, they bowed in submission. I then stunned them by offering them the command of the future Navy. I acknowledged their superior lineage and experience in naval warfare compared to my land-based commanders. I proposed that upon the fleet's completion, they should lead it. I offered Werner the position of Fleet Admiral and Klein as Vice Admiral. The offer left both men shocked by my boldness and trust. Overwhelmed by this gesture, they felt a surge of absolute loyalty. Werner stood, trembling with emotion, and swore to dedicate his life to building the Navy in exchange for my trust. Klein followed suit, pledging his life to create an invincible fleet that would strike fear into the Sorin barbarians. Seeing their fervent commitment, I smiled, gesturing for them to sit. There is no need for such formalities. I trust both your talents and your loyalty. Naval development is the lifeblood of Conford. I rely on you, especially regarding the design and construction of our new warships. Please apply your expertise with the utmost precision. Yes, my lord. We shall not fail you. The two replied in unison, eyes burning with newfound dedication. The tense atmosphere in the meeting room instantly thawed due to my unexpected display of trust. Edgar and Brendan exchanged a nod, impressed by their lord's political finesse in stripping them of their former power while simultaneously entrusting them with critical new responsibilities. It effectively neutralized potential threats while maximizing their motivation. As the meeting concluded and the others departed, the office fell silent, save for the crackling of the fireplace. I remained alone, hands pressed against the map on my oak desk, my gaze fixed on the symbols representing Conford and its surroundings. The strategies finalized: naval expansion, army training, fortifications, and work for relief, wove together in my mind, forming a grand blueprint for the future. A surge of accomplishment and heavy responsibility stirred within me. I stood up and walked to the window, pushing it open. The cool, crisp air of early autumn rushed in, carrying the scent of soil and late-blooming roses, dispelling the room's stuffiness. I took a deep breath, exhaling the fatigue of recent days. Looking out, I surveyed the main city of Conford and the surrounding fields. In the distance, golden wheat swayed in the sunset, promising a harvest. Nearby, smoke rose from the town, filled with the vibrant sounds of life. The peace stood in stark contrast to the hellish memories of the Iron Islands. Finally, I can breathe, I thought. The past 6 months had been harrowing. From stabilizing the crisis early in the year to the surprise attack on Tyrol, the high-stakes Operation Hannibal, and the integration of the Southwest Peninsula, every step had been a gamble. Now, the situation had opened up. The Tyrol fortress stood as a shield against the Solonians, and the Southwest Peninsula provided the strategic depth Conford once lacked. Amber Bay, protected by the peninsula, was now secure enough to focus on trade and naval development. A secure Southwest Peninsula means a secure Amber Bay, which ensures the foundation of Conford. I realized I could now focus on domestic affairs, specifically the maritime trade with the Field Territory. The Field Territory, the kingdom's purse, remained wealthy despite Solonian raids, possessing vast resources and commercial networks. Establishing this sea route was vital for the capital and technical support needed for my military and territorial development. Thoughts of the Solonians, particularly my old rival Harold, cast a shadow over my mood. The abnormal calm after their occupation of the Iron Islands suggested a greater storm was brewing. Was Harold gathering strength for a massive post-harvest raid? I shook my head. Conford was no longer the weakling it once was. The vast southwest peninsula required an army of over 100,000 to effectively besiege. If the Solonians committed their main force to a raid, their rear would be exposed. If you dare to empty your nest, I will strike your heartland, I mused. With nearly 10,000 elite standing troops, I had the capability. Yet, I remained cautious. I knew Harold was too cunning to leave such an obvious opening. This silence was likely a trap. Where will he strike? Sea, land, or from within? My gaze sharpened, settling on the region where thousands of Iron Island refugees had recently been resettled. Integration took time, and loyalty was not yet proven. I pushed the troubling thought aside. Worry was useless. The priority was to use this strategic window to grow stronger. If I was powerful enough, no scheme could prevail. With cautious confidence and lingering fatigue, I left the office, walking toward the main castle. The sunset stretched my shadow, and the autumn breeze eased my tense nerves. Both the territory and I myself needed this moment of respite. At dusk, the setting sun bathed the stone buildings of Huenum in an ominous, reddish hue. A dusty, battle-worn cavalry unit rode through the streets, causing residents to shutter their windows and watch with trepidation. Leading them was Count Boris, the governor of the Three Borders, a man in his 60s with a gaunt, cold face and the imposing aura of a veteran. He wore practical, dark leather armor and a black cloak, his only ornament being the Plantagenet emblem on his chest. His eagle-like eyes scanned the dilapidated streets and the gaunt faces of the locals, his brow furrowing slightly. The governor's mansion was an old but grand stone fortress. A crowd awaited his arrival. Dozens of local notables were gathered, the area brightly lit. They wore fine silks and family crests, their faces fixed in rehearsed smiles. Local gentry, barons, knights, the attorney general, the minister of finance Raphael, and the garrison commander were all present in their finest attire. The air smelled of spices and wine, clashing with the dust of the streets. Raphael, a plump, slick-looking man, stepped forward and bowed deeply. "Welcome, Governor. I am Raphael, Minister of Finance. We have prepared a banquet at the Plantagenet Roads restaurant to honor your arrival. Please, do us the honor." Count Boris did not even dismount, merely casting a cold, icy glare at Raphael that froze the smile on the man's face. Count Rochefort ignored the gathered dignitaries, dismounted, and handed his whip to a guard. After whispering instructions to a sharp-eyed aide in black robes, he strode directly into the governor's mansion, leaving the welcoming party behind. The aide turned to the stunned crowd, bowing slightly. "The governor appreciates your kindness, but he is under royal orders to manage the three regions. With bandits rampant and the border unstable, he has no time for banquets. Please return home." The atmosphere turned icy. Raphael's smile froze, his face draining of color. The attorney general's hand hung mid-air, the garrison commander smirked, and the local gentry exchanged uneasy, bewildered glances. This new governor was utterly cold. As the heavy oak doors slammed shut behind Count Boris, they seemed to seal off two different worlds. Outside, the local elite were left with their confusion, resentment, and a feast that no one would attend. Inside, the hall was dim and dusty, filled with maps of the frontier and mountains of files. Count Boris discarded his cloak and approached the desk, his gaze hardening as he pointed at key bandit-ridden zones and border friction points on the map. "Pass the order," he commanded, his voice metallic. "A curfew is in effect. All documents, military or civil, must come to me first. Summon the scout captain. I want the latest intelligence. And bring me the tax ledgers and armory inventories for the last 3 months." "Yes, my lord." The staff scrambled to obey. In the study, candlelight illuminated Boris's grim profile. He buried himself in the files, scribbling notes with a quill, his fingers tapping the desk in rhythmic, tense frustration. The room smelled of moldy paper and ink, thick with a suffocating pressure. As he read, Boris's brow furrowed, his eyes turning cold as frost. The records claimed Hewingham was a granary, yet the actual grain delivered by the military colony was negligible. the books were riddled with holes. The yellow household register showed massive discrepancies. Ghost households, runaways, and hidden land titles were bleeding the state dry. Worse, land explicitly designated as official military farmland was registered under private names, revealing deep-seated corruption. Crack. Boris slammed the ledger onto the desk, the impact shaking the furniture. He looked up, his face a storm-dark mask, his eyes gleaming with lethal intent. "Come in." His voice cut through the door like shattering ice. A sharp-eyed guard in black armor entered and bowed. "What are your orders, Count?" He was a trusted confidant from the royal capital who knew his master's temper well. Boris grabbed a blank sheet and began writing furiously, his quill digging into the paper. The scratching of the nib sounded like a blade, each stroke fueled by suppressed rage. He handed the stern order to the guard. "Summon the Attorney General, the Minister of Finance, the garrison commander, and all the gentry who waited outside today. They are to appear before me immediately. No excuses." The guard hesitated, glancing at the order. "Count, it is evening. They are likely at the Rhodes restaurant." Boris's gaze pierced him like a blade. "What did you say?" The guard lowered his head. They were resentful after being turned away, so they went to the Rhodes restaurant to dine, claiming they didn't want to waste the feast. Boris laughed coldly. "A feast? While the frontier burns and the people starve, they have the leisure to dine. A fine set of Plantagenet subjects." He stood, his towering shadow looming over the room. "Take a squad of personal guards to the Rhodes restaurant. Tell them this is not a dinner invitation. It is a military tribunal. If they are not at the Lord's Hall within 1 incense stick's time." His eyes flashed with murder. "They will be charged with delaying military operations and executed by military law." The guard trembled and saluted. "And," Boris added, his voice chilling, "have their fine wine brought here, untouched, to the front of the governor's mansion. Let everyone in Hewingham see what our officials feast on while the region suffers." "Understood." The guard rushed out, his boots echoing in the hall. Boris stood still, his breathing heavy, his exhaustion replaced by grim resolve. He knew this would shatter the facade of the local power structure. But he also knew that in chaotic times, one must use drastic measures. Without this, the northern frontier would crumble like a sandcastle. He returned to the map, his eyes fixed on the crisis points. Outside, the night deepened, and Hewingham's power structure was about to face a bloody reckoning. In the Rhodes restaurant's Amber Hall, the atmosphere was lively, filled with wine and laughter. Despite the earlier snub, the wine had smoothed over the embarrassment. The table was laden with roasted suckling pig, honeyed goose, and river trout. Raphael, the Minister of Finance, raised his ruby-encrusted glass. "Don't worry, gentlemen. The new governor is just putting on a show of severity for his superiors. Tomorrow, we'll bring a gift and explain the local customs. He won't dare cross us. Drink up." The others laughed, relieved, treating the earlier rejection as a minor inconvenience. The clinking of glasses continued until... bang. The heavy carved door was kicked open, splintering wood flying. The laughter died instantly. A squad of guards in black armor flooded the room, sealing the exits with lethal efficiency. The lead guard stood motionless. He scanned the terrified faces and held up the Plantagenet emblem. "By order of the governor, the Attorney General, Minister of Finance, Garrison Commander, and all local gentry are to report to the Lord's Hall immediately for a military briefing." He added, his voice dripping with iron. 10 minutes. Anyone who fails to arrive will be charged with delaying military operations and executed by military law." The private room fell into a deathly silence, the aroma of the feast suddenly turning nauseating. Raphael's smile froze. His wine glass clattered onto the velvet tablecloth, spilling red wine like blood. The Attorney General dropped his silver fork, and the local gentry turned pale, trembling as if ready to collapse. "Move," the guard barked. Moments later, they arrived at the governor's mansion in Hewingham. The Lord's Hall was starkly different from the restaurant, brightly lit but filled with a chilling, murderous atmosphere. Count Boris sat upright in the former governor's high-backed chair, his face a cold, imposing mask in the candlelight. Raphael and the other officials knelt before him, disheveled and gasping for breath, still stained with the remnants of their interrupted feast. The stench of alcohol mixed with their cold sweat created a pathetic, ironic scene. Outside, the untouched banquet was being dumped by guards, attracting stray dogs. Ignoring the kneeling crowd, Boris stared coldly at the open crates filled with ledgers and files. He slammed a ledger back into the box, the sound echoing through the silent hall. "I came here by royal decree," Boris declared, his voice like thunder. "I've only checked a fraction of these accounts, and the corruption is staggering." He pointed at the boxes, his rage peaking. "Where are the military colonies? The crown allocated vast lands, yet less than 10% remain. The rest has been embezzled. And the census? The records are riddled with ghost households and hidden populations. The rebels grow stronger because of parasites like you. You gorge on the people's blood and the army's grain, turning the northern frontier into a bandit's den." He stood and paced toward them. "Without land, there is no grain. Without grain, there is no army. Without a stable rear, how can we reclaim the northern frontier?" Stopping before Raphael, Boris said coldly, "Tonight, your only task is to return every acre of stolen land, with interest." He turned to the room. "From today on, every account will be audited. Anyone who dares to obstruct this will face the consequences." Boris drew his sword and slashed through the corner of a hardwood table, the blade slicing through the wood like paper. "Just like this table," he roared, his killing intent leaving the room in terrified silence. The kneeling men were deathly pale, sweat pouring down their faces as if the blade were at their own throats. Boris had completed his inauguration in the most ruthless manner possible. He hadn't touched the welcome feast, but he had made the entire Hewingham elite feel his absolute authority and icy intent. Hewingham was destined to have a sleepless night. Boris's display was like dropping a red-hot iron into the stagnant mud of the northern frontier, triggering a violent reaction. Unlike the chaotic Hewingham, the Rockefort estate was plunged into deep, silent slumber. The castle sat like a dormant beast amidst the hills, shrouded in the dim starlight. Only the occasional torchlight on the ramparts and the rhythmic footsteps of guards signaled that vigilance remained. In a cold, elegant bedroom in the main castle, Charlotte awoke with a start. She sat up, gasping for air, her silk nightgown soaked in cold sweat. Her heart hammered like a trapped bird. It was that dream again. In the dream, she had returned to Confort. She saw me in the castle hall, looking handsome and steady, possessing the authority of a true ruler. I had succeeded. I was no longer a mere heir, but a powerful lord. She felt a surge of pride. Then, the dream twisted. A vague, elegant figure, the princess, appeared beside me, radiating a noble aura. I turned to the princess, offering a gentle, relaxed smile Charlotte had never seen before. I took the princess's hand, and they stood together so perfectly that Charlotte felt like an unwanted intruder. She tried to call out or run to them, but she was frozen in place. She watched them vanish into the shadows of the castle, leaving her alone in the cold, empty hall. That image had jolted her awake. Charlotte pressed her trembling hand to her chest, trying to calm her racing heart. The room was dark, save for moonlight casting pale patches on the floor. She lit a candle, but the flickering light could not dispel the gloom in her heart. She sat at her vanity, staring at her reflection. Her face was thin, with dark circles under her eyes and a pale, bloodless complexion. Her once vibrant blue eyes were now filled with worry, confusion, and exhaustion. "What is wrong with me?" she whispered, touching the mirror. "Carl is doing well. I should be happy for him. Why do I dream like this?" Rationally, she knew my success secured their future. Emotionally, the dream was a thorn piercing her deepest fear, distance, and replacement. She knew me. Beneath my cold, decisive exterior as a lord, I hid a sensitive, vulnerable soul that needed comfort. She had always been the one to provide that warmth, our deepest bond. But now, she was trapped in this beautiful cage, separated from me by mountains and war. Meanwhile, Princess Louise was by my side, sharing my daily life, my struggles, and my victories. Will he need her comfort? A chilling thought struck Charlotte. Will he grow accustomed to her presence? Might he even fall in love with her? The thought sprouted like weeds, choking her. The princess was noble, beautiful, and elegant, appearing during Conford's darkest hour to share in my hardships. And she? A distant, nominal fiancé who could only wait and worry. Carl, do you remember our promise? Do you love me as I love you? Charlotte wept into her hands. My endurance, from Conford to France City, then to the Huenham estate, was it all for nothing? A wave of uncertainty and the fear of abandonment threatened to drown her in loneliness. A night owl's cry pierced the silence. Charlotte looked up, catching sight of a small jewelry box on her vanity. Inside lay a rustic sapphire brooch, a birthday gift I had found for her back in Carnford Castle. Though simple, it was the most precious witness to their budding love. She gripped the cold brooch, the sharp edges grounding her. No, I cannot think this way. She wiped her tears, forcing a fragile smile at the mirror. Carl is not that man. He promised he will keep our vow. Yet, a cold voice whispered, in the face of power, reality, and long separation, are promises truly enough? The night was long, the candles weeping. Charlotte sat in the shadows, clutching the brooch as if it were her only lifeline in the dark. Fear, doubt, and longing wove an invisible net around her. Suddenly, a sharp cry from the next room shattered the silence. Klein, her son. Instinctively, Charlotte rose and hurried to the nursery. The nurse was struggling to soothe the wailing infant. My lady, you should rest, the nurse whispered apologetically. The little master is likely hungry or had a nightmare. It's all right, Jenny, let me, Charlotte said, her voice regaining a mother's resolve. She took the flushed, crying infant into her arms. Feeling his warmth and dependence, her despair began to thaw. Go and rest, she told the nurse. I will watch him for the rest of the night. The nurse hesitated, then bowed and exited. Charlotte returned to her room and sat on the edge of the bed to nurse him. Sensing his mother, Klein stopped crying and began to feed greedily. The room filled with the soft sounds of the infant nursing. Charlotte gazed down at him with tender eyes. In the candlelight, Klein's features, his nose, his lips, his deep-set eyes, looked increasingly like his father's. He was like a tiny, soft Carl, relying entirely on her. This resemblance acted as a powerful sedative for her anxious heart. At least she had Klein, the undeniable bond of their love. Carl might be tempted by power or the princess, but surely he wouldn't abandon his own flesh and blood? The thought brought a sense of bitter humiliation. Must she rely on their child to secure his loyalty? It felt like a trampling of her pride, yet in this isolated, perilous situation, it was her only solace. Soon, Klein finished feeding, let out a small burp, and drifted back to sleep. A faint smile lingered on his tear-stained face. Charlotte cleaned him, tucked him in, and lay beside him, wrapping her arms around his warm little body. With her son nearby, the cold bed warmed, and the scent of milk dispelled the loneliness. She held him tight, seeking strength from his presence. Yet, in the haze between sleep and wakefulness, her anxieties resurfaced. The image of Carl standing with the princess contrasted sharply with her solitary night. Fresh tears slipped from her closed eyes, soaking the pillow. The night remained long, her strength and vulnerability intertwined. The warmth in her arms was real, but the chill in her heart remained. She held her son tighter, clinging to the only light in the darkness. The governor's mansion's recent display of power had thrown the stagnant, corrupt waters of Huenham into chaos. Count Boris knew a single show of force wouldn't cleanse the deep-seated rot of local officials. They were masters of deception and would surely retaliate once the initial shock faded. Thus, Boris refused to sit idly in the mansion waiting for doctored reports. After dismissing several corrupt officials and securing confessions, he made a shocking decision. He would go to the front lines himself, accompanied only by his trusted scribe, surveyors, and a squad of personal guards. He would leave the capital to inspect the villages of the western and northern frontiers personally, measuring every field and auditing every record. He intended to uncover the truth behind Huenham's reputation as the northern frontier's granary, leaving the local officials in a state of panicked outrage. Though autumn had arrived, the autumn tiger heat wave made the season stifling. The northern and western frontiers of Huenham were rugged, poorly maintained, and infested with bandits. Many considered it madness for a 60-year-old count to abandon his comforts for mountain trails and dry rations. Yet, Count Boris remained resolute. In mid-August, his elite, compact team departed Huenum for the western mountains. The journey proved far more grueling than anticipated. The official roads were eroded gullies, carriages frequently bogged down, requiring manual labor to extract. The sun scorched the ridges, filling the air with dust and the stench of decay. Refusing his litter, Count Boris rode on horseback alongside his soldiers. Despite his sweat-soaked hair and cracked, parched lips, his eyes remained sharp and vigilant. Initially, the scribes complained, but seeing the elderly governor lead by example, working late into the night to verify data, they were shamed into silence and dedication. The social decay they encountered was far more chilling than the terrain. Western villages were merely clusters of dilapidated shacks. Abandoned homes and overgrown ruins were everywhere. Worse, the ditches were filled with rotting corpses, attracting crows and wild dogs, creating an unbearable stench. Even veteran soldiers turned away in horror, while the scribes from the royal capital were reduced to vomiting. The few remaining villagers were gaunt, ragged, and paralyzed by terror. Seeing the well-equipped soldiers, they hid in their shacks, peeking out with fearful, guarded eyes. With no able-bodied men left, only the elderly, women, and children labored on the barren, neglected land. Boris dismounted to question a blind old man hiding behind a woodpile. The man trembled, stammering that the officials were gone, taxes were unpaid, and their land had been seized. This pattern repeated throughout the journey. Through these accounts, Boris pieced together the grim reality of the western frontier. Local gentry and corrupt officers had colluded to seize military colonies and state land, registering them as private property through fraud and usury. Displaced farmers were forced into tenant servitude with crushing rents or fled to become refugees and bandits. Local administration had collapsed. Officials were either complicit or had fled. The northern granary was hollowed out by corruption. Watching the desolate valleys and the fortified manors of the gentry, Boris seethed with rage. When the people no longer fear death, how can you threaten them with it? Oppression breeds rebellion. The ledgers I had seen earlier were merely the tip of the iceberg. The rot in Huenum was 10 times worse than I had estimated. Without purging these parasites, reclaiming the land, and restoring order, the region faced inevitable uprising. Boris ordered his scribes to document every seized plot, every ruined village, and every refugee camp as ironclad evidence. As the sun set, the scribes complied. Looking over the scarred land, the governor's resolve hardened like cold iron. I knew a brutal, complex reckoning had begun. I would have to perform a surgical, ruthless excision to save the northern defense line. This half-month inspection was a calculated, surgical strike against the deep-seated rot of Huenum. Boris and his elite guard pierced the heart of the corrupt network linking local gentry and officials. The gentry were stunned. They expected a show of force, not a governor getting his boots muddy to reclaim every inch of stolen land. "Does this old fool think Huenum is his backyard?" they sneered. "He's a lunatic, wasting his final years digging in the dirt. Let him dig. He can't break the power structure of Huenum alone." In secret, they cursed me, hoping I would die of exhaustion or be killed by bandits. They vastly underestimated the old general's iron will. A veteran of long-distance campaigns, I was accustomed to hardship. My resilience remained undiminished by age. Though the journey left me gaunt, my eyes remained sharp enough to pierce any deception. When the investigation hit core interests, the gentry turned to open, cunning resistance. At several manors, stewards and armed thugs blocked the surveyors, brandishing fraudulent deeds and citing private property rights under the kingdom's code. They attempted to hide behind legal loopholes. Boris's legal aides retorted sharply, "Private property? These are registered military colonies. Since when did state land become your private estate? You know these deeds are forged. Obstructing this investigation is an act of treason." I held the ultimate authority. Before leaving the capital, I had secured a secret decree from the Empress granting me discretionary power to stabilize the north. I was authorized to deal with corrupt gentry on the spot, provided I avoided mass unrest. "Seize them," I commanded. My guards immediately arrested the ringleaders. Their manors were sealed, and I initiated swift, public trials for treason, land theft, and collusion with bandits. The charge of colluding with bandits became my most potent, flexible weapon. In the lawless borderlands, any armed local force refusing government orders is branded as banditry. Count Bora's labels resisting local magnates as bandit nests or rebel accomplices, deploying elite troops to ruthlessly suppress them. Estates are seized, defenders executed with heads displayed as warnings, and all land and assets confiscated as enemy property. This bloody repression serves as a powerful deterrent. Seeing arrogant local tyrants executed, other gentry are cowed into cooperating with land audits and surrendering their ill-gotten gains. Boras immediately repurposes these reclaimed lands to stabilize the populace and restore production. Most fertile land is prioritized for displaced farmers. The government provides seeds, tools, and rations, with a 3-year tax exemption to quickly transform them into tax-paying smallholders. This initiative draws refugees back to the land, offering them hope. Key lands near military outposts are assigned to veterans for military colony duty. This allows troops to farm, achieving partial self-sufficiency and easing logistical burdens. Despite the bloody process, these combined measures yield immediate results. Huenum, once stagnant, begins to show signs of life. Refugees return to farming, and military morale improves as logistical pressure eases. News spreads of the old marshal, who fights for the people against the gentry, earning him deep reverence. Titles like Boras the Just circulate among the commoners. Conversely, hatred among the gentry and old bureaucrats reaches its peak. I have not only seized their wealth but trampled their rules and dignity with severed heads. A more intense, hidden retaliation brews in the soil of their hatred. Boras has suppressed Huenum's rot, but I know the true storm is just beginning. I am now locked in a life-or-death struggle with the local powers. Count Boras's iron-fisted reforms have triggered a frantic backlash from the entrenched interests of Huenum. While they lay low under my blade, they have secretly bared their poison fang. My habit of visiting the grassroots makes me a vulnerable target for a silent, lethal strike. While surveying disputed land near a remote village in the south, a crisis erupts. The village sits in an open valley backed by dense, hilly forests. Boras discusses maps with his scribe and the village head, while my 100 personal guards rest nearby. Suddenly, a sentry sounds a sharp alarm. Enemy attack. Movement in the woods. The guard captain draws his sword. Mount up. Prepare to fight. The well-trained personal guards form a defensive line, eyes fixed on the forest. To my shock, thousands of figures emerge from the trees like a swarm of ants. They are ragged, starving, and armed with crude tools like sickles, pitchforks, and sharpened sticks. Their sheer numbers are terrifying. An estimated 10,000 rebels surround the small village. I have faced bandits before, but they usually flee at the sight of my elite guard. These rebels are different. They advance with a desperate, maddening silence that creates a suffocating pressure. The captain exclaims, "We are 30 miles from the southern fortress. How did 10,000 rebels gather without warning?" I remain cold, my expression one of cynical insight. I sneer to my officers. Warning? The southern commander likely wants us devoured by these bandits. Our location and the garrison's oversight are clearly a gift from our enemies. The officers realize this is a trap set by local bureaucrats and gentry to eliminate the governor. My lord, we are outnumbered. Let us break through and escort you out, an officer urges. I look at the encroaching tide and the panicked villagers, shaking my head. Too late. We cannot outrun them in this terrain. We would be slaughtered if we scatter. I turn toward the village and bellow. Abandon the field. Retreat into the village. Use the houses to build a defensive line. Hold until reinforcements arrive. The guards execute the order, shielding me and the staff as they pull back. I enter the village threshing floor, where the villagers are trembling in terror. I command their attention with a voice like a bell. Look outside. 10,000 rebels are surrounding us. Do you think hiding will save you? These locusts will leave nothing behind. They are more savage than the Sorin barbarians because they have nothing to lose. My words strike home, stirring their memories of bandit atrocities. If you want to live, grab your tools. Fight alongside my men. We have walls and houses. If we hold, the garrison will come. If the village falls, we all die. My composure becomes the villager's anchor. Survival instinct overrides fear. The village leader shouts, "The old marshal is right. Fight for our lives. Fight. Hold the village," the crowd echoes. Driven by desperation, the villagers armed themselves with farm tools, blockaded streets, and fortified the perimeter under the soldiers' direction. I dismount to personally oversee the defense, strategically deploying my limited forces. The 100 personal guards form the backbone, while hundreds of villagers fill the gaps, handling logistics and support.